Hello, everybody. Welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
All right, and today is a really exciting episode because this is the series finale of our series of episodes called Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter, which is about the evolution of modern birds. Um, yeah, that's. I'm definitely very excited to get to this point. But before we jump in, how are things going?
Things are pretty good. It's been a nice week so far. I'm certainly excited and I'm super happy for you that you've made it to this point. The capstone of your fantastic, amazing series on Cenozoic bird evolution. But on my end, a couple of things I've been up to. I have been reading Adam Rutherford's book, The Book of Humans,
Hmm.
and it's a brief history of culture, sex, war, and the evolution of us. That's what it says on the cover.
Nice.
And so this came out in 2019 in the UK as a Humanimal, if some of you
Oh
may
yeah,
be
that's right.
aware. And Rutherford, he's an anthropologist. He's written a lot about human genetics, and I'm familiar with his work because I had previously read A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which is a beautiful breakdown of how human genetic studies work, and looking at ancient DNA and tracing population expansions and migrations through time, as we had talked about on Humanity: A Prologue, and just kind of clarifying the ins and outs of some more popular culture stuff,
Hmm.
like 23andMe, like is that actually good science or not? And
Oh yeah.
it's a fascinating book. And the Book of Humans is remarkable because it very much is a prehistory book about humanity and the hominin journey from the beginning.
Right.
But it mostly is in the context of comparing human behaviors to those of other animals to
Hmm.
see whether
Interesting.
some yeah to whether see some features are you know actually fairly common in the animal kingdom or not. And it
Right.
turns
Right.
out that yeah, there's a lot that we share. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's an evolutionary basis for this sort of sharing. It's not as if all animals that use tools share a common ancestor that would
Right.
have used tools. It's just like these behaviors and the capacity for those behaviors are very widespread.
Right.
Um, and so I'm about halfway through that. I just finished the whole section on tools, which included a very extensive discussion about like, well, what is a tool? How do you define tool? Um, what are like animals that use tools that don't rely on their hands like we
Hmm.
do to manipulate objects? And it goes into like the history of warfare a little bit and agriculture. um, and now I'm on the section about sex,
All right.
and the question of like, do are humans the only animals that use sex in a pleasurable non-reproductive way? And it turns out that no, that is not the
Right.
case at all.
Hmm.
There's many amazing and at times shocking anecdotes that are discussed throughout,
Right.
as is the case for this sort of thing. Um, no, it's definitely a very wonderful book, and we'll certainly put a link in the description in case you all are
Hmm.
interested in checking it out. Rutherford's a really great writer, and he certainly knows how to weave wonderful stories. So that's been my big reading adventure. Um, a little bit of exciting announcement. I finally got the chance, and I should have announced this last episode, but I forgot. I apologize in advance. But Emily Grassley of the Brain Scoop, famous YouTube series about natural history, which she had left earlier this year, she has her new show out now. This came out about a week ago, called Art Lab, and I got to catch a little bit of that. Um, it's basically looking at phenomena or organisms in nature and like how they've been portrayed in art over the years, and then like using art to kind of understand like their behaviors and their life histories.
Hmm.
It's sort of like a fun little comparative exercise. And so like one episode's been released already on the periodical cicadas. These are the ones that like they the females lay the eggs in trees and the young hatch, and they stay underground for like 12 years or whatever.
Right.
and then they pop out of the ground in one huge ceremony of life in which they all scramble to mate and then repeat the process again while at the same time providing just a buffet of food for everything in the area.
You're right, right.
It's very notorious if you live in like the New England area
Mm-hmm.
or what have you, because when this happens, they're very loud insects and their calls just echo across the fields, and they're just all over the place. They're interested in getting to a high perch to mate, and they can't. I guess they don't really distinguish trees from like people. So
Right.
people that all like walk around and these bugs are just crawling all over them. And like they freak out and they scream because, oh my god, these bugs, these huge bugs. But I assure you, like, they're not dangerous. They can't even bite. They don't
Right.
even have mouths. They are alive to reproduce and die.
Yeah.
That is basically, what they're all about. So if you're interested in entomology, it's a really fascinating phenomena. And so Emily spent the whole episode talking about cicadas throughout history and like what they've come to represent to different peoples around the world. Sort of cycles of life and death. Really, really fascinating stuff from an anthropology perspective. So I definitely highly recommend that. I super enjoyed it, and we'll also put a link in the description for that as well. And I guess just kind of rounding this out, I had neglected last episode as well to put a little update about the new BBC series Eden that I had been enjoying. Narrated by Elena Bottom Carter and talking about regions around the world where the human impact on the environment hasn't been so dramatic, and the lands are more or less wild places. All those controversial term as that is.
Yeah.
And the last two episodes took place in Africa, and they were particularly fun. The first one from 2 weeks ago was on the Namib Desert, which is in southwest Africa. It hangs out near the coast, and it's in Namibia, if you could tell. And that was a pretty fun episode. It's a big desert environment. A lot of really fascinating footage of common African wildlife that is living out in a desert, which it seems weird. Like, oh wait, lions and giraffes and elephants in a
Right.
desert, aren't these savanna animals? Well, no, like they're fairly adaptable. They're found in many different environments that can support them. It just so happens that Namib has enough moisture and enough plant life that it can support a decent population of megafauna. There's one pride of lions, and that's scattered about not a pride of lions, a couple prides of lions, and it's like a herd of elephants that goes through there. There's like Gemsbok antelope, which is an oryx, a species of oryx, has markings on the face. And that was a pretty nice episode. Admittedly, it was a little bit too familiar for my taste because the Namib is a region that is featured in a lot of BBC documentaries.
Yeah, that's true.
It becomes a point of like, oh, we're kind of revisiting these animals to see what they're up to. So,
right.
The lions, for example, have been filmed before. Hunting giraffes as well, because there's
Yeah,
about that. The darkling beetles that climb up the edges of sand dunes in order to collect the moisture. That's been seen before.
Yeah.
That was a Planet Earth 2, I think, in particular. And so it was a pretty fun episode. It wasn't anything too spectacular. But the last episode that they did was on the Luangwa Valley in Zambia,
Oh yeah.
which is in the east of Africa. It's a much lusher environment. It's more of a traditional grassland savanna slash like marshland.
Yeah.
And again, wonderful footage of African wildlife. There's a really fun scene with these baboons running in the water, and again, just like really, really nice photography. I guess I don't have too much really to add.
Sure.
That kind of stood out to me because, and this is a conversation I think we've talked about quite a bit with nature documentaries. There are some organisms that have been done to death, and while they are fascinating, like sometimes it's kind of nice to get something a little bit different.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, big African megafauna. It's like, oh wow, I haven't seen that before.
Right.
But in all seriousness, like it's been a really nice show so far, and I do enjoy seeing footage of these particular animals because they're so iconic and they're very pretty.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't mind something a little bit more, unique or different for a change.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that this weekend's episode is on the Galapagos, and we'll
Ah.
certainly get something more of what I'm looking for
Right.
in the
Yeah.
series. So that's really my biggest things that have been with me. How about you, buddy?
Yeah, not too much relevant news on my end. I'm still working on the thesis and trying to write as much of it as I can and as quickly as I can. But yeah, that stuff takes time. So yeah, mostly been working on that. Um, like I guess as I mentioned previously, and it's still a case now. So Eden actually got released in the U.S. before it got released over here, which is pretty unusual for a BBC documentary. So I still haven't seen it yet myself, beyond a few clips that have been posted on YouTube. Definitely sounds very cool, and I do understand, the sentiment about this stuff has been done before, and especially considering from what I hear, the first episode had quite a bit of fresh material in it.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, right. So yeah, I definitely see your point of view there, and I think I would probably agree if I had seen it. Um, just in case anybody's curious, one documentary series that I think did really well in giving a fresh perspective on what seems to be a very well-trodden documentary subject is the BBC documentary that's simply titled Africa, that came
Mm.
out. Wow, a number of years ago now, but it's still one of the relatively recent series, I guess, or at least that's what I think of it that way. Um, and yeah, I really like how much new material they were able to fit into that series, because I remember seeing the premise of it originally. I was like, really, another documentary about Africa? Haven't we seen this before? But when I actually watched it, no, they had a lot of interesting and rarely featured segments and fauna, and yeah, I ended up really liking it. And I especially like their episode. I think it was the episode on the Serengeti, or something like that. Um, but where they open up with a shot of the big herds of wildebeest. That's the
Yeah.
classic type of shot that we've all seen before, if we're if we grew up watching nature documentaries. Um, but then immediately they say something like, "But there are other stories to tell," and then they switch the perspective, these little agamid lizards that are trying to catch flies. Um, near a pride of lions, because lions attract the
Yeah.
flies. Yeah, and so these lizards are just jumping around on the rocks, and sometimes literally landing on top of the lions themselves and just snapping at these flies. And that was what the focus of that segment. And yeah, I was like, wow, yeah, that's really cool. Kind of using the megafauna as a backdrop for these lesser known stories. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Yeah, oh wow, Africa, that is a really good one. Probably one of the most unique sequences of all,
Mm.
certainly was in the Sahara episode, where they set time-lapse cameras on a little hill, and they just set it out on the dunes.
Oh yeah.
And they played it for I forget how many years they did this, but you watch the dunes move like waves on the beach, and it is so surreal that this is a thing that happens.
Right.
I mean, it's the wind, of course. The wind pushes the sand over time, and that's how this works.
Hmm.
Um, but wow, that was new. That was completely new. I'd never seen that before, and
Yeah.
that immediately raised that documentary up for me as far
Right.
as being probably one of my favorites that the BBC has
Right.
done.
Yeah. 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 Definitely one of my top documentaries as well. Yeah. It's really good. So check it out if you can.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah. I guess I guess that's most of what I have to say update wise. Do you have anything else to add?
Not particularly.
All right then. I guess we can jump into our episode then. So this is the series finale of Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter, and we are going to talk about a really big group of birds called Passeriformes, the so-called perching birds, and these are the songbirds and their relatives. And this group of birds is super diverse. It is 60% of all bird diversity, and it's also a very familiar group to us. I think I think for most people, the generic image you have of a bird, even if it's not actually uh, a specific species is probably going to be based on a songbird. Like you might think of like a pretty small bird that perches in trees, eats seeds and insects, and sings. And yeah, that's pretty much a general model of what a passeriform bird is like. So in many ways, they kind of define what we think of as a bird. And so we are going to talk about this very successful group in the episode today. But before we do that, on the next slide, I do have a bit of a reminder to give everybody is that we are about to record our 1 year anniversary special for the show. So it has been 1 year of Through Time and Clades approximately. And we are going to be recording that episode on August 20th. Now, to celebrate, we would like to answer viewer questions, like do an Ask Us Anything for that episode. So if you have any questions for either of us at all, relating to the material we talk about, or personal questions, which we will answer as we see fit. You may send us your questions either by leaving a YouTube comment or sending us an email at timeandclades@gmail.com or tweeting at us at our Twitter handle, which is also at timeandclades. And if you send us any of those questions before August 20th, we will try our best to include them in the episode. So yeah, feel free to do that if you have anything in mind, and we look forward to answering them. We already have received quite a few questions already, so yeah, we're definitely looking forward to addressing those, because there are some pretty good questions in there, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely looking forward to this.
Excellent, excellent. All right, I guess with that, we can continue and start our episode proper. So on the next slide, this is just to provide a bit of context for the groups that we've been looking at in the last couple of episodes. So we're very, very close to kind of finishing our overview of all crown bird diversity, all modern bird diversity. In the previous episode, we looked at the falcons and the parrots, and it turns out that even though these two groups were not really suspected to be close relatives by most people in the past, genetic evidence has provided very strong evidence that the falcons, the parrots, and the group we're talking about today, the passeriform birds, actually are each other's closest relatives, and they form a clade called Eufalconomorphae, a very long name. Sorry, I did not come up with these names. Within this group, the parrots and the passeriforms are closer to each other than to the falcons, and together they form a clade that has been named psittacopedids, which is basically combining psittacopedids, the parrots, and passeriformes, the passeriform birds. So yeah, kind of a combo name to form the clade name that unites both of them. And so we just have one last group left to cover in this entire series before we finish covering all crown bird diversity, and that is the passeriform birds. And on the next slide, I will discuss some of the major features of this group. So in terms of the fossil record, Passeriformes is known from the Eocene onwards. The crown group Passeriforms, their oldest fossils are known from the early Eocene, I think, of Australia, and that'll come into play a bit later. Yeah, just remember that the oldest known Passeriform fossils are from Australia. But as we shall see, Stem-passeriform fossils are also known from the Eocene onward and have been found outside of Australia. So it seems that some of the earlier relatives of Passeriforms actually dispersed quite widely. Now, Passeriforms include over 6,000 living species. And yeah, I mentioned earlier that they account for about 60% of all living birds. And that's kind of the figure that corresponds to that, over 6,500 living species. In fact, just passeriform birds alone outnumber all living mammal species. So yeah,
Wow.
yeah. That's quite impressive. Yeah, there are about like 6,000-ish living mammal species by the latest count, I believe. So yeah, passeriforms match or exceed that already just by themselves. Now, I guess just as a point of clarification, I think a more common name for the passeriform birds is the passerine birds, and that's a very common name that you'll see, and it is also much shorter and easier to say than passeriforms. So I know why a lot of people use it, and I've definitely used it, including in previous episodes of this show. But I've been trying to get myself to say passeriform birds because the technical name of this group is Passeriformes. And so technically, if you want to turn that into a vernacular name, passeriform matches that more closely than passerine, which, if it were to correspond to a technical name, would probably be corresponding to a name like a passerine or something like that. But I know most people use the term passerine. It's not like I'm trying to change people's usage of the word. It's just something I want to try to stay consistent with myself. They are also found pretty much worldwide. Yeah, they're found on every continent except for Antarctica. But everywhere else, every terrestrial environment, you can find some manner of passeriform bird. Now, another common name for the passeriforms is the perching birds, and you'll also see that pretty commonly too. I think that name is a little bit misleading because passeriform birds are definitely not the only birds that are able to perch. I mean, I would say probably most other types of modern birds are able to perch in trees or on elevated perches or such. Because nearly all modern birds have this kind of reversed innermost toe, that hallux, to help them grip onto objects. However, it is true that the passeriforms have certain specializations for perching that are not found in most other birds, and you can see that in the image here. So first of all is that the hallux and the corresponding toe, the hallux and the corresponding claw are particularly large. You can see in the image here that the backward facing toe, that's the hallux, it corresponds to our big toe. It is it is almost as long as the longest forward pointing toe on the foot here, and that is pretty unusual because in most birds the hallux is a bit smaller than the longest forward pointing toe, but in passeriforms it's very close to the same length, and you can see that the claw on the hallux too is also really large, and so together with the forward pointing toes, this forms a very kind of effective pincer that the bird can use to grip perches with. And furthermore, passeriforms are also so specialized for perching with their feet that they actually have a simplified kind of the musculature of their feet. And so we say that a lot of the intrinsic muscles of the forward pointing toes are lost. And what this means is that basically, when we talk about muscles, we can speak of extrinsic muscles versus intrinsic muscles. And so here we're talking about muscles of the foot. And so extrinsic muscles are muscles that also attach to parts of the body beyond, in this case, the foot, like the part of the body we are examining here. So a lot of muscles in the foot, for example, they attach on one end to the foot, but on the other end to, say, the lower leg. So those are extrinsic muscles. And whereas intrinsic muscles are kind of contained entirely within that section of the body. So an intrinsic muscle of the foot attaches entirely to points within the foot. And so in passeriforms, the intrinsic muscles that attach to the forward-pointing toes have been lost. And so basically, a lot of these muscles are normally for sort of finer kind of movements of the toes, whereas in passeriforms, they don't really have these muscles. And so their feet are very specialized for perching. They're very good for getting a grip on things, but they tend not to use them for much else, like, something like a raptor can use its feet for like grabbing and killing prey, whereas passeriforms don't really do that as much. I mean, sometimes there are some passeriforms that have been known to like grip food with their feet, but yeah, it's definitely a lot more difficult for them to kind of specialize into a niche where they would need to use the feet as weapons, because they are so specialized for using their feet entirely for perching. And a character that is not really related to perching as much is that passeriforms they tend to make very complex types of nests. And some researchers have definitely suggested that this is one of the adaptations that has allowed them to become so successful. Like the typical kind of stereotypical idea of a bird's nest that we might have in our heads basically is a passeriform nest, like this very finely woven structure, that sits in a tree and made of very fine plant materials. That's basically a passeriform nest, and not all birds build that kind of nest. But it is pretty versatile because you don't necessarily need like an existing kind of a hole or something to make your nest, like some other birds might. You can build that kind of nest in a tree, you can build it in a bush, you can build it on the ground. So passeriforms have a lot of adaptive potential because of that. Very versatile. And in terms of the shape of the nest, there can be some variety in different passeriforms. So some of them, they build more of a ball-shaped nest, so it has a kind of roof on top. It's a contained dome, and then there's a little side entrance that goes in through the side, like a little hole on the side. Whereas others are probably more similar to the stereotypical idea of a bird nest, where it's a bowl-shaped nest, so it's open on the top, and the parent bird sits on top of it. But either way, passeriforms have this really remarkable kind of nest-building capability that probably has allowed them to adapt to a large number of very different habitats. Do you have anything else to add about this group of birds in general?
Well, I do have a question regarding the nest behaviors.
Yeah.
I know in popular culture, and of
Mm-hmm.
course I've seen this in nature books and whatnot.
Yeah.
The birds lay the eggs in the nest, and like they sit on the eggs to keep them warm
Yep. Mm.
throughout the day. But now in popular culture, you'll sometimes see once the babies have hatched
Mm.
that the parent goes onto the nest and then sits on the babies like it does the eggs.
Yep.
Is that a thing that actually happens or no?
Uh, yes, actually, it is. So in passeriforms, especially because the babies are born quite helpless. So these are some of the most altricial birds there are. The term altricial means basically an animal that is born relatively helpless and needs a lot of parental care. It can't run around or feed itself, and in many cases, it's born blind and can't even see when it's born or hatched. And that is the case in passeriform birds. And so passeriform birds are often born like basically naked or with very little or no feathers on them, and so they actually have trouble regulating their own body temperature. And so, yeah, it is actually pretty common for parent birds to continue sitting on the babies. After they have hatched to keep them warm, and it's only when the babies get a little bit older that the parents can start spending more time away from the nest and start doing full time kind of feeding duty. So yeah, that does happen. Something that pop culture shows that doesn't happen so often is that birds using the nest as kind of their home all year around. Because yeah, there's this kind of popular perception that birds live in a nest, but the primary function of the nest really is for child rearing. Basically, it's for rearing the babies. And so when birds are not breeding, they don't necessarily live in the nest. Like an adult bird, they can just sit on a perch in a tree and just sleep there. It doesn't matter to them. So yeah, a nest is typically not like a home for an adult bird. Now there are some exceptions. There are birds that build roosting nests where they'll actually build a nest to sleep in for and spend the night even if they're not breeding. But yeah, that's relatively rare. Most types of passeriform birds and most types of birds in general, yeah, they don't, if they're not breeding, they don't need a nest. So yeah. Um, all right, I guess we can move on to the next slide. So before we talk about living passeriform birds, let's have a look at some of their extinct relatives. And in fact, I gave a kind of preview of this group last time. So this is the particular species I'm showing on this slide is psittacopedids from the Eocene of Germany. It's yet another bird from the very productive Messel Formation. And it is a very small bird. It's like a sparrow-sized or smaller. And when it was first discovered, it was thought to be like a very early stem parrot. And the main reason for this is because it has zygodactyl feet. So zygodactyl means that two of the toes point backwards. And so not only the innermost toe, like it does in most birds, but also the outermost toe is also swiveled around to point backwards. And parrots have this type of foot, and passeriforms do not. So very early on, it was thought that Psittacopes was a stem parrot, but as I mentioned last time, we now, with the knowledge that passeriforms and parrots are closely related to each other, people have kind of re-examined a lot of these early parrot-like fossils, and in this case, they found that it is actually more likely that Psittacopes is on the passerine lineage and not on the parrot lineage. So it is a stem passeriform. Now, since Psittacopes was described in like the late 90s, we have found several other types of birds that seem to be closely related to it, and so they formed this group called the psittacopedids altogether. So far, they've only been found from the Eocene, but they've been found in both Europe and North America, and they all have these zygodactyl feet. Something that is unusual for this group of birds in this part of the phylogeny is that they have 20 or more vertebrae in front of their hip girdle. Usually, birds in this part of the tree, in this part of the phylogeny, have fewer than that. So, yeah, that's kind of odd. We don't know why that might be. And they seem to be they're all like very small birds, like they're all like sparrow sized or smaller, but they seem to be very varied in their ecologies. They have exhibit a lot of different types of beak shapes, and I'll show a few examples on the next slide. In Psittacopes, you can see that the beak is kind of relatively short and sort of blunt. So it's hard to say that whether this is specialized for anything too specific, but yeah, probably pretty useful for kind of plucking small insects, small seeds, and things like that. And we'll see on the next slide a few examples that are clearly like specialized for more obvious kind of types of diets. And yeah, they were once thought to be stem parrots, but now considered stem passeriforms. They have various similarities to passeriforms in like the shoulder girdle and the forelimbs. So yeah, it does seem that this is the best supported position for them at the moment, even though they have those zygodactyl feet. And on the next slide, I'll show a few more examples of these psittacopedids because it turns out that they are actually quite diverse. So on the leftmost side is Eofringillarostrum. This particular species is from the Green River Formation of the United States, which is yet another great fossil site for birds. And there's also a second species of Eofringillarostrum from the Meso as well. So it seems to have been found on both of those continents. And Eofringillarostrum has a very clearly finch-like beak, so it's got a kind of very triangular, conical-shaped beak, and we know in modern birds that this type of beak is very useful for cracking open seeds. And so it seems that Eofringillarostrum was already specialized for seed-eating diet long before there were any actual, like, true passeriforms that were doing this, that we know of at least. And in the middle, we have a Pumiliornis, which is also from the Meso, and it's got this very long and slender beak. And something really interesting about this particular specimen. So that's actually what the little white box is kind of supposed to be referring to, but because I don't show you the full version of this figure where the box is magnified, you can't actually see it here, but if you go to the original paper where this figure comes from, the little white box is supposed to indicate that this specimen preserves gut contents, and those gut contents are pollen. So it seems that this bird, Pumiliornis, was visiting flowers, and possibly it was drinking nectar from those flowers. And certainly that very long and narrow beak would have been very useful for doing that. And as we shall see, there are a lot of living passeriform groups that have become adapted to feeding on nectar. And so this is kind of an early example of a stem passeriform doing that. And then on the rightmost side here, we have Psittacopes. This is from the Eocene of the United Kingdom, from a formation called the Lendon Clay Formation. And this is a site that has produced a number of really good bird fossils as well. They are not quite preserved in the way they are in the Green River and the Meso, where all the soft tissue is also preserved. But the nice thing about Lendon Clay fossils is that they tend to be preserved more three-dimensionally, so they retain more of the original shape of the bones. And so Parasitocopes, in fact, was named just earlier this year. In fact, fun fact, Parasitocopes was the first fossil dinosaur to be named in 2021. So yeah,
Ooh.
that's kind of a neat thing. And so this is a pretty nice fossil. It's actually known from not just the skull that I show over here, but also many of the limb bones as well. And they kind of show us a lot of the details of psittacopedid anatomy that weren't obvious from the flattened Green River and mesofossils. And Parasitocopes had yet a different kind of beak. You can see that it's kind of moderately wide when you see it from the top and from the bottom. So you can see that on the two left-hand side images. And you can see that the kind of nostril openings kind of extend very far forward, close to the tip of the beak. And this is a type of beak that is often found in birds that kind of swoop through the sky and capture insects in flight. So think things like swifts and swallows. And so, yeah, it seems that Parasitocopes might have been doing something similar to that, where it probably sat on a perch and then watched insects fly by, and then it would fly out and quickly scoop them up in midair. And so clearly you can see that there's a lot of ecological diversity in the psittacopedids. So they were a very successful kind of early radiation of Stem-passeriforms. Do you have anything else to add before we continue?
Well, that's incredibly fascinating. I'm not used to seeing 3D skulls of
Mm-hmm.
birds like this.
Right.
That's a remarkable preservation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, the London clay fossils are pretty amazing. Alrighty. So on the next slide, there's another group of passeriform-like fossil birds. Um, these are the zygodactylids, and as their name suggests, they also have zygodactyl feet. Um, and they seem to have lasted longer than the psittacopedids. So the earliest fossils of these guys are known from the Eocene, from around the same time as the oldest psittacopedids. Um, but the very last ones that we know of make their way all the way up into the Miocene. So they lasted for quite a long time. And they're also known from both Europe and North America. Um, and they don't seem to have been as ecologically diverse as the psittacopedids, as far as we can tell. They mostly all look like the one you see here, which is a lovely fossil. This one's from the Green River. But yeah, we don't see the kind of very extreme specializations like we do in the psittacopedids. The beak of zygodactylids tends to be a lot more generalist looking, like they look like a beak of, say, a thrush or something like that. So something that eats both seeds and insects and fruit, and can adapt to a pretty wide variety of diets. Zygodactylids tend to be a bit bigger than the psittacopedids. So they're not a huge amount bigger, but they get up to, like, yeah, thrush sized is about right. Um, and they have been debated in terms of their phylogenetic position, especially that those zygodactyl feet have really confounded people over the years. It has been considered that maybe they're closer to things like woodpeckers, because of course the woodpeckers and their kin now have zygodactyl feet. However, in more recent years, more recent studies suggest that they are actually Stem-passeriforms as well. And there are various features in the limbs that support that. In fact, the general proportions of the skeleton in zygodactylids look a lot like passeriform birds. It's really just the zygodactyl feet that are pretty different. So that also seems to be the best supported position for them at the moment. Let's see. So on the next slide, we can see how these two groups are related to the crown passeriforms. And so we see that it seems that psittacopedids are a bit more distantly related to crown passeriforms compared to the zygodactylids. Which makes sense because overall the zygodactylids are more passeriform-like in terms of their overall anatomy. And within the passeriforms, we see three major lineages. One group is the New Zealand wrens, and one group is called the Suboscines. And then the final group is called the songbirds or the oscines. And we will look at each of these groups in turn. But do you have anything to add before we continue?
Not particularly.
All right. Well, I think there's one thing that's pretty striking when you look at this phylogeny here, is that you got these two extinct groups that are both zygodactyl, closely related to the crown passeriforms, that are not zygodactyl. And then if you go, further outward, you'll meet that the closest living relatives of the passeriforms, which are of course the parrots, which do have zygodactyl feet. So that raises an interesting kind of scenario, right? Because that seems to suggest that perhaps having zygodactyl feet was actually ancestral to this entire group, like down to the last common ancestor with parrots, and probably even beyond that too, because we actually mentioned this in the last episode that there are some somewhat parrot-like fossils that seem to be stem members of the psittacopedids that have zygodactyl feet. And so it seems that passeriforms, even though they have this really distinctive foot that is not zygodactyl, they might have descended from a long line of kind of zygodactyl ancestors. So what's up with that? Now, in terms of like adaptive kind of benefits of a zygodactyl foot versus the passeriform type of foot, I don't think we have a very clear understanding of that. Yeah, both of these types of feet seem to be very good for gripping perches, and as far as I think anyone has been able to tell, I don't think there's a very obvious advantage to like kind of switching between those two. But we actually do have a possible understanding of how the passeriform foot might have evolved, and I show a diagram of this on the next slide. So we have actually kind of touched on this before, but it seems that in evolving kind of unusual orientations of the toes in birds, something that seems to be really critical is the movement of the musculature in the foot during embryonic development. And so these diagrams, these are very schematic diagrams. Like an actual bird foot obviously doesn't look anything like this, but I'll try to orient us as much as I can. So the blue blocks and lines, those are meant to be the bones of a bird foot. And on top you can see two bones that correspond to the lower leg, and then the two ankle bones, and then you can see a series of the long bones of the foot, the metatarsals, and then you can finally see the little toe bones down below. And then on either side of the foot, these diagrams show two different muscles attaching to the foot. Now there are more muscles that attach to the foot in birds, but these two are the critical ones in this particular study that this came from. So on the leftmost side shows a kind of a normal condition in a bird foot. So there are these two muscles that tug on the foot from either side during embryonic development. And when you have these two muscles and they're developing as normal, you get basically a normal bird foot where only the innermost toe is reversed. And the innermost toe in birds is reversed because of how kind of the bones in the foot are twisted in this area. So kind of the default position for the first toe becomes this sort of backwards pointing condition, basically. If nothing happens to influence that. Now, in parrots, which is in the middle here, or what the middle is supposed to represent, one of the muscles is lost. The muscle that pulls on the inner side of the foot is lost. And in case you haven't made that out, on the right here is supposed to be the inner side of the foot, and so the short toe there is the backwards pointing one, and then on the left side is the outer side of the foot. So in a parrot, the inner muscle is lost, and so only the outer muscle kind of pulls on the foot during embryonic development. And when that happens, it turns out that this asymmetry in forces causes the outermost toe to reverse backwards and give you a zygodactyl foot. This was a really cool study because what they also did was that they paralyzed this outer muscle in developing parrot embryos. And when they did that, they found that the parrots developed a normal bird foot and not a zygodactyl foot. So that clearly shows that this muscle is kind of critical in developing a zygodactyl foot. All right, so that's perhaps what the kind of ancestral foot was like in the psittacopedids, the clade including both the parrots and passeriforms. But how about passeriforms themselves? Well, it turns out that on the rightmost side, that's supposed to represent a passeriform foot. And as we talked about, passeriforms have lost a lot of the muscles in the foot, including both of these muscles. They don't have either of them. And so it turns out, when this happens, the symmetry of the forces acting on the foot is restored, and so the passeriforms get a normal bird foot again because of that. And so the authors of this study hypothesize that perhaps along the line leading to passeriforms, that was when this muscle was lost, and then that caused the foot to develop in this manner. And perhaps, because having a passeriform-like foot is not really a disadvantage in kind of gripping or perching capabilities, natural selection did not act against this, and they have kept this foot to this day. And so, yeah, I think this is a really elegant study, and it seems pretty plausible to me. However, I should mention that the paleontologist Gerald Meyer, who is one of the top bird paleontologists working today, has pointed out that the zygodactylids don't seem to have lost the innermost muscle that parrots have. It may be that there are different developmental processes at work, kind of regarding the development of the zygodactyl foot in Stem-passeriforms. But I think nonetheless, probably the general gist of this idea is likely to be correct. It does provide very strong evidence that this muscular action in the foot is what's causing these different toe orientations. And yeah, it definitely wouldn't surprise me if some version of this happened in the evolution of passeriforms. Do you have anything to add to this?
No, but it's a fascinating idea for sure.
Alrighty then. So, let's go to the next slide, and then we will dive into the passeriforms proper, and we'll start looking at all the different major groups. And yeah, I do want to stress that because there are so many different passeriform groups that I am not going to go through like every single one. I'll be leaving some groups out. Yeah, like there will be some groups that I'll leave out, and I'll try to focus on groups that have featured heavily in kind of evolutionary studies, or are familiar to many people, or occupy very interesting kind of phylogenetic positions. And so basically, yeah, I'm definitely not going to go over every single passeriform group. And if you want to learn more about passeriforms, like well, Wikipedia is not a bad place to start. There are a lot of resources that kind of list all the birds of the world and things like that. You can do a deep dive in there, and they'll show you all the different passeriform species. So yeah, definitely a lot of resources out there to use. But yeah, I'll try to give a pretty representative overview. However, and I guess just to explain like why I'm shoving like 60% of all birds into a single episode. The main reason, well, there are a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, is kind of practical reasons. Like if I had to spend the same amount of time on like all the passeriform groups are proportional to their diversity, like that I have for all the other non-passeriform bird groups, this series would be twice as long as it is now, and would take, accordingly, twice as much time to complete. And as much as I like doing this series, I kind of intended it to be this long. So yeah, I don't think that this is a series for that. Maybe in the future we can do like a series that's just on passeriforms, and then we can go into all those. But yeah, I think for overviewing bird diversity in general, I think this makes logistical sense. And the second reason is that throughout the series, I've kind of taken more of a anatomical and paleontological perspective on things. And the thing is, with passeriforms, even though they are so diverse, their anatomy and fossil record are not very well studied at all. Like there is in fact a cliche in kind of ornithology that all passeriform skeletons look the same. There's no variation in them at all. And well, as you might expect, that's That's not true, but we still don't have a very detailed understanding of the variation that is present. And so, for many of these groups, if I go very deep into them, there aren't really many features I can talk about that. Oh, this is a feature that is very distinctive for this particular group anatomically, and many of them don't really have a known fossil record either. So there's not much for me to say. And yeah, I think the kind of the main reason I wanted to make this episode was to give a sort of a deep time evolutionary perspective on many of these groups. And so, whereas if you only want to know about the living members of the group, there are already plenty of resources that are available. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that I decided to compress the passeriforms into just a single episode. Now, things are changing on that front, on the research front. For example, one of my lab mates, Lizzie Steele, her PhD thesis is primarily on identifying, anatomical features that distinguish the major passeriform subgroups, and kind of matching that up with the genetic phylogeny that we now understand pretty well for passeriforms. And so, I think in the near future we will have a lot more to say about passeriform anatomy, and we'll also have a better sense of how what the various fossil passeriforms that have been described are, because there are a few that have been described, as we shall see, but a lot of time people don't go very far in trying to figure out where they are in the phylogeny. And so, yeah, I think in the near future that will change. But for now, yeah, that's the state of the field. And so that's the reason why I'm compressing all of these birds into a single episode, even though it's kind of unfair. All right. Anyways, moving on. Let's look at the kind of individual groups of passeriforms. And so, first up is the New Zealand wrens, or acanthocitids. And so, this is a group of passeriforms that they form the closest living relatives to all other living passeriforms. And so, they are equally closely related to all of the other living passeriforms. Which means that they are not, in fact, a type of wren, which are a type of songbird, but they do look kind of wren-like, and so, of course, when Europeans who are familiar with wrens saw them, they gave them the name New Zealand wren. But yeah, they are actually evolutionarily very distinct from true wrens. They do have a fossil record from the Miocene onward, from New Zealand, in fact. So we know that they've been on New Zealand at least since the Miocene. And something really interesting about the particular species, because I think there's only one that's been found from those early Miocene deposits, is that it seems to be a crown New Zealand wren, a crown acanthocitid. So it actually seems to be a member of like the modern radiation of New Zealand wrens. Meaning that it is more closely related to some of the living New Zealand wrens than to others, which is really interesting, because that means that the living lineages of New Zealand wrens have already kind of split apart from each other back in the Miocene, if this is correct. So
Wow.
yeah, there seem to be a pretty ancient lineage in more ways than one. Now, unfortunately, there are only two living species of New Zealand wren that are still alive. Many of the recent species of New Zealand wren are extinct, and I'll give a few examples on the next slide. And they were recently extinct, wiped out by human activity, most likely. But yeah, there are only two living species that are still alive today. One is the species pictured here, the New Zealand rock wren, and the other has a funny name called the rifleman. Which is not a name you would expect to be given to like a tiny little, very very cute bird. But apparently it is called that because the its colors are apparently resemble military uniforms in New Zealand. So that's apparently the
Hmm,
reason. But
that's fun.
yeah, yeah. Um, but in any case, yeah, these are really small birds. They are about the size of like the true wrens, which are themselves quite small. And they mostly feed on insects. They don't like to fly very much. They have very short wings, as you can probably make out in this photo. So they don't really tend to fly very far. They'll fly for like short distances between trees or to kind of get to point A to point B. But yeah, they don't like to fly very much. And in fact, some of the recently extinct species, as we will see, were flightless. And let's go to the next slide to have a look at some of those. Um, So there are a number of recently extinct New Zealand wren species that are only known to science from kind of fossil remains. So one of these is the one on the left here, Dendroscancer, the so-called long-billed wren. Um, and so that's a skull on top compared to a modern New Zealand wren on the bottom. So you can see that Dendroscancer was a bit bigger than the modern New Zealand wrens and had a much longer bill. And we know that Dendroscancer was probably flightless because its breastbone was like not very well developed for flight attachment muscles. So yeah, it probably could not fly. Now, it is thought that probably Dendroscancer used this very long bill to maybe search for in crevices on, say, things like tree trunks. So, like, even though it couldn't fly, it could probably like cling to tree trunks and climb up them and then kind of probe for food in little crevices there. And there's another genus that's known from two species called Pachyplecas. That is also another recently extinct acanthocetid known only from fossil remains, and those are called the thick-legged wrens, and that's because they have very stout hind limbs, and they probably were also flightless, or at least nearly flightless. It's thought that probably they use a very strong hind limbs to kind of scratch around in the leaf litter for food, so probably ground foragers. It seems that the New Zealand wrens occupied quite a few different types of niches in recent times. And finally, there's this species called a Stephen's Island wren. And this is one that actually was encountered by Europeans. Now, by the time Europeans learned about this species, it had only been confined to a little island called Stephen's Island, which lies between the two main islands of New Zealand, the North Island and South Island.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Stephen's Island is a tiny little island in between those two. And fossil remains do show that Stevens Island wren used to live on both of the big islands too, but by the time Europeans arrived, it was only confined to this little one.
Hmm.
And it was also flightless, and it was very small. It was smaller than Dendroscancer and Pachyplecas. In fact, observations of its behavior suggest kind of describe it as being kind of mouse-like. It would kind of run around in like little rocky crevices and dart in and out of like hiding spots and things like that. Now, unfortunately, eventually Stevens Island and wren was also wiped out from Stevens Island, and there is a bit of a legend surrounding this, and the legend is that the lighthouse keeper who recorded the presence of these birds, it is said that his cat, singular, his cat single-handedly wiped out all of the Stevens Island wrens
Wow.
from the island. Now, that story is probably not true, but it does seem that by the late 19th century, when Stevens Island wren was last recorded, cats had been introduced to the island, and they did breed rapidly, and almost certainly the dramatically expanding population of feral cats did in the flightless Stevens Island wren. So yeah, it probably wasn't a single cat that did it, but it was feral cats that probably wiped them out, which is very unfortunate.
Hmm.
And we might touch on that later. But in any case, this was kind of the last of the recently extinct acanthocetids to have been lost to us in recent times, and so now we only have the two flying forms that are left. But of course, New Zealand has done a lot in recent years to conserve its remaining native wildlife, and so hopefully the remaining species of acanthocetids can continue to survive. Do you have anything to add about this group of birds?
Well, the only thing I'll add is I know we've talked about this a little bit outside of the show, but
Mm-hmm.
it's very possible that we might have our first pop culture presence
Oh, right.
of these birds. So speaking of birds, there's a show called Tuca and Birdie that was released on Netflix a couple of years back, but Netflix decided not to continue doing new seasons. But so Adult Swim stepped in and bought the show, and now it's airing there. It's currently doing its second season at the moment. And one of the characters, Dr. Joanne, who's a psychologist who works with the character Birdie, um, we are under the impression that she is a New Zealand wren, um, just based on like the coloration and the fact that we kind of went through all the different perching birds and we couldn't really find like an exact match for
Right.
that character. And I think you even went and asked your supervisor.
Yes, yes, yeah. So my supervisor, Daniel, he's a very experienced and skilled birder, and he's been birding all over the world and seen like thousands of different bird species. So I sent him a picture of the character, and he suggested maybe that she looks a bit like a rifleman. So yeah, I do see the resemblance in the kind of the color scheme. So yeah, it is possible that she was based on a New Zealand red.
Yeah, which is, I mean, would be awesome if that's the case. Because I
Right.
mean, this is a fascinating group of birds.
Indeed,
You know,
indeed.
I might as well just like tweet at like the show's creator and see like, hey, what character, what bird is this character,
Right.
and see if we can get something definitive. Because I know for the last season, like a bunch of birders got together and did this whole article where they went through all the bird characters and confirmed like which species were which. But they haven't done that yet for this season,
Right,
so
right.
kind of out in the dark at the moment. But I just thought that was kind of fun to share.
Yeah, yeah, that is kind of funny. And would be cool to have these guys in pop culture because, yeah, they occupy a very distinctive spot in kind of passeriform phylogeny, and they represent a very distinctive lineage in themselves. So, yeah, I definitely hope that we don't lose any more of them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, so let's continue on to the next slide. And so we're going to take a little bit of a small detour here and look at some fossil passeriforms. So it seems that we do have some fossils of passeriforms that appear to be closer to the two remaining groups of passeriforms, the Suboscines and the songbirds. Um, but it is not entirely clear where they fit into that phylogeny. Um, but it turns out that the Oligocene of Europe has played host to a large number of very good passeriform fossils. And in fact, these are the earliest passeriform fossils that we know, crown passeriform fossils from Europe. So I mentioned earlier that there are some fragmentary remains from Australia of crown passeriforms that are older than that. But outside of Australia, the oldest known crown passeriform fossils are these fossils from Europe, from the Oligocene. And there are some really good specimens that are known. This isn't even all of them. I just show two examples here. So the first one, the one on the left, is Wazlockia, which is, I think, the first of these to be described as known from an essentially complete skeleton. You can kind of see the skull is kind of scattered to the top, and then various limb bones are kind of scattered all around. But together they make up an essentially complete skeleton. And then here's another one that was described earlier this year, in fact, called Krosno-Ornis. This one's from Poland and is also known from a basically complete skeleton. You can see that even some of the feathers are preserved here. And it does seem that there was a pretty wide diversity of passeriform birds that were living in the Oligocene of Europe at this time, because there are many others that have been found. There's one called Jamna, there's one called Rosovia ornis, and one called Winnicavis, just throwing some names out there. And there are some remains that haven't been named as well. So yeah, pretty diverse set of passeriforms in Europe during the Oligocene. And before that, we see no sign of them in Europe or outside of Australia at all. So interesting. But yeah, in any case, these fossils certainly are very informative, or potentially informative, for telling us what early passeriforms were like. But it's pretty uncertain about where in passeriform phylogeny they belong. For both of these species, actually, for both the Wazlockia and Krosno-Ornis, it has been suggested that they are Suboscines, so they actually specifically belong to the Suboscine lineage. But yeah, I think we will probably need like a more detailed understanding of passeriform anatomy, like my lab mate Lizzie is doing, before we can make very confident kind of assessments of where they go. But yeah, definitely very tantalizing and very informative for those of us interested in the evolution of these birds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Next, I think we'll look at the Suboscines specifically. But do you have anything to add to this?
Not really.
Alrighty, let's continue. The Suboscines. Now, where does that name come from? Well, basically, it's because the songbirds are also called the Oscines, and so basically, the traditional idea was that you could split all the passeriforms into the songbirds versus those that are not, and then those that are not, they get called the ones that are below the songbirds because people had
Mm.
this idea of the ladder, some species being higher than others and so on, and songbirds were considered like quote unquote the highest birds basically, and so the ones that are just quote unquote below them were called the sub-Oscines, the ones just below the songbirds. Of course, now we don't really think of evolution in that way. It would be incorrect to do so, but the name is still used. We still call these birds the Suboscines. And it used to be that the acanthocetids were also considered Suboscines, but then more detailed, first anatomical studies already suggested this, but then the genetic studies confirmed it, that acanthocetids are actually outside of both the Suboscines and the songbirds, and so they're not considered members of this group anymore. But there still remains a kind of like a core group of these Suboscines. And so, in terms of their known time range, they are known from the Oligocene onwards. So, I said that we weren't sure where those fossils I just showed belong in the phylogeny, but we do have some fossils from the Oligocene, like late Oligocene or so. We do have some fossils from the Oligocene that do seem to be uh, fairly clearly to be Suboscine specimens from Europe. Yeah, those seem to be the oldest known as Suboscine fossils, if some of those early Oligocene specimens aren't Suboscines. And there are about there are over 1,000 living species. In the modern day, Suboscines are most diverse in the Americas and specifically in South America. So, kind of South America is the center of their diversity and where they are most diverse. But they're also found in tropical regions of Afro-Eurasia and Australasia as well. And we do know of a few skeletal features that identify the Suboscines. So, first of all, seems to be that they have what we call a finger-like projection on the third metacarpal. What does this mean? Well, on the top here, the top image, we're showing the carpometacarpus, so that is the fused wrist and palm bones of a Suboscine. And so the part that points towards the wrist, towards the base of the hand, is pointing right in this image, and the part that points towards the fingers is pointing to the left in this image. And then you can see that towards the bottom of the bone and pointing left is a little projection that's labeled FP, and so this has been termed like a finger-like projection in the literature. And so this is where the third finger, so the equivalent to our middle finger, would attach to this carpometacarpus. And yeah, there's this little finger-like projection here that seems to be characteristic of a Suboscines. Something else that's quite interesting skeletally is that the middle ear bones of Suboscines are very distinctive looking. In mammals, we have three little tiny bones in our middle ear that help transmit sound into the inner ear so that we can perceive sounds. In most vertebrates, there is only one bone in the middle ear, and the reason for that is because we mammals, we actually turned some of the bones in our lower jaw into middle ear bones, and that's why we have three. And that's a very interesting story, but it's probably one for a different series. Whereas in all other vertebrates, there's only the one, and so the one that is shared by most vertebrates is called the stapes, or also called the columella. They refer to the same bone, and it turns out that the stapes, or columella, has a very distinctive shape in Suboscines. So on the lower left here, you can see what is a typical avian stapes, typical bird stapes. And so the top end of the stapes here is basically what eventually connects via layers of cartilage and all that to the eardrum. So this is the part that initially comes in contact with the sound as it travels through the ear, and then it travels down towards the bottom. In this image, in the terms of this image, towards a disc-like structure called the footplate, and then from there it transmits the sound further into the inner ear. And in most birds, the footplate of the columella or stapes is a kind of flat disc-like structure. So yeah, that's how it looks, and you can see that pretty clearly in the image here, I think. But in Suboscines, there's what has been called a swollen footplate of the columella, and you can see how that looks like in the lower right over here. That's a Suboscine columella. I think it looks like Hershey's Kisses chocolates, basically. Yeah, they're kind of swollen into this cone-like shape. And yeah, that's a distinctive feature of Suboscines. There are a few other birds that have this, but none that are especially closely related to the passeriforms. So yeah, this seems to be a pretty good way of distinguishing Suboscines from other types of passeriforms. However, the stapes doesn't commonly preserve in the fossil record because it's such a small bone. So yeah, not as helpful when we're dealing with fossils. But yeah, it is something that is there. Do you have anything to add before we go to phylogeny?
Not really. This sounds like a good overview of the Suboscines.
All right. Okay, so let's look at their phylogeny. Kind of somewhat helpfully, I guess, the Suboscine phylogeny seems to divide pretty clearly, or more or less clearly, well, we'll see, more or less clearly by geography. So there are two major lineages, so Eurylimedes and Tyrannides. And the Eurylimedes on the left here, they are basically the Afro-Eurasian Suboscines, and they all form a clade. And then Tyrannides are the American Suboscines, and they can be further split into two groups: the Tyrannida and the Furnarida. And we'll look at each of these groups in a bit. But I guess if you're wondering why birds like this would be called like scary sounding names like Tyrannides and Tyrannida. Why are they calling them tyrants? Well, we'll get there. I'll reveal that a bit later. But yeah, let's continue to the next slide and look in more detail. So first, let's look at Eurylimedes, the Afro-Eurasian Suboscines. So these are some of the major groups that are in this particular lineage. So we'll go from left to right, and I'll quickly introduce each of these. So first of all, we have a group called the Azetes. The Azetes are only found in Madagascar today, and many of them have these really colorful wattles around their eyes. You can see that in the photo here. Yeah, pretty distinctive looking. And some of them are nectar feeders, like the one pictured here is, for example. So that's what that really long and thin, slightly curved bill is for. So yeah, some of those are nectar feeding specialists. And then we have two groups of Eurylimedians that are both called broadbills. And now these two were initially thought to be closely related to each other. And as their name suggests, they both have very broad bills. But thanks to genetic studies especially, we now know that the so-called Asian broadbills are actually more closely related to the Azetes, and the African and green broadbills are more closely related to the other groups of Suboscines. So yeah, they are not in fact each other's closest relatives, but they do look similar in some ways and behave similarly. Like they both like to perch in trees, and they just stay very still for long periods of time. And when they find something they want to eat, then that's when they fly out and grab it with that really big bill of theirs. So some of them prefer to eat insects, some of them prefer to eat more fruit. That depends on the species, but yeah, that's essentially how they live. In some ways, they're a lot like frogmouths in terms of their ecology. So you might remember from the episode on Strisaures, the nightjars and their relatives. That was episode 5, I believe. That frogmouths are this group of predatory birds that kind of sit still in trees for long periods, and they have these really big broad bills that they use to capture their prey with, and that's essentially how they hunt. They just sit still for long periods and fly out and grab something when they see it. And yeah, the broadbills kind of behave like that. They're generally smaller than the frogmouths, but yeah, they kind of operate similarly. And in fact, there are some rather unfortunate stories where people will talk about how, oh, you could just shoot all these broadbills that are sitting in a tree one by one and they won't even fly away or anything because they are
Mm.
just that committed to sitting still. um, yeah, that pretty unfortunate. It's probably their way of like, it's probably staying still helps them avoid being detected. But of course, if they've already been spotted, that doesn't help so much. Some of them can be very colorful. Um, and now, yeah, they come in two of these different clades. And so one I've called the Asian broadbills because most of them are found in Asia. However, there is actually one species from Africa. So yeah, lemza breaks. These names are not the most precise. Um, and then the other clade consists of species that are found in Africa, but also the green broadbills, which are found in Asia. So yeah, actually they aren't quite segregated that well, but we do know that they belong to like these two independent lineages and aren't each other's closest relatives. And then next we come to an interesting group that is only known from one species. So this is a rather drab-looking bird called the sapayoa, but it is interesting because it is the only member of Eurymenides that is found in the Americas, specifically tropical America. And so, yeah, this is an Afro-Eurasian Eurymenidian that is found in the Americas. So, yeah, the only one. That is
Hmm.
pretty special. And then finally, we have the pittas, which are an extremely colorful group. Like, yeah, birders love to see pittas because they are so beautiful. And they are found in tropical regions of Africa, Asia, and Australasia. But they are not as easy to see as you might think. They are mostly found in very dense types of forests, and they forage mostly on the forest floor. You can see that they have pretty long legs. So yeah, they're pretty good at kind of running around on the forest floor and catching small animals to eat. And yeah, because they live in these very dark forests down where the sunlight hardly ever shines, it can be pretty difficult to get a good look at them. And so yeah, they are highly prized sightings by birders. Alrighty, anything to add before we go on to the American Suboscines?
Well, I think it's definitely important to clarify regarding the passeriform birds that I've mentioned like the histories of taxonomy for a lot of these birds throughout
Yes.
the series because it's something that I've followed closely. Like things that are called things that are called wrens aren't actually wrens, and things that are called broadbills are actually two different lineages, and it gets confusing fairly quickly.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's definitely it's something very worth clarifying because yeah, the thing is with common names of passeriforms, yeah, do not expect them to match up with the phylogeny at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like yeah, just from a starting point, yeah, do not assume that just because two different birds share the same common name that they are likely to be closely related. Because a lot of the time, as we shall see, that is not the case whatsoever. So yeah, yeah, you will have to dispense with like all your preconceptions of like where these birds are likely to belong based on their common names because yeah, we're gonna meet some real surprises in terms of like relationships here.
Oh yeah, and it's like um, trying to like look up these birds too can be
Yes.
trouble as well because of this taxonomic history. Like some books will have like this clade name and it'll include these birds, and then other books, oh no, like those birds are actually two different clades, or
Right.
they include something completely different. And yeah, it can be a lot to keep up with.
It is, yeah. So yeah, if you have trouble keeping up with all the different groups in this episode, like, do not worry because that is perfectly normal. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, like like for me, someone who studies birds, like it took a lot of effort to like actually wrap my brain around like the diversity of passeriforms and how they're all related. And even now, I often do have to look up like, oh wait, what is this species? Like, where does it go in the phylogeny? Like, like yeah,
I'm no
yeah,
better either.
right. So yeah, don't worry. Like, um, there is no quiz at the end of the series. Like, this is just to give everybody a sense of what the diversity is like out there. And if you are interested, there are plenty of resources out there to help you find out more about all of these different groups. But if you're just here to get a general understanding of what passeriform birds are like, I think if you come away with the understanding that they are a big, diverse, and very confusing group, I think that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right. Okay, so let's look at the American Suboscines, the members of Tyrannides, and specifically Tyrannida. Um, again, they are split into two major groups, Tyrannida and Furnarida, and we'll look at Furnarida on the next slide. But yeah, for first of all, the Tyrannida, most of these are primarily arboreal species, the tree-dwelling birds, and they are most diverse in the American tropics. And so you have groups like the manakins, for example, which have these like amazing courtship displays. Like this is a male wire-tailed manakin, for example. You can see how colorful they are, and they do all these kinds of dances and like very elaborate kind of displays to attract females. In fact, you might have seen this in some nature documentaries. Like they like to show like footage of these mannequins that like slide back and forth on their
Oh
perching.
yeah.
Often accompanied by like appropriate music or inappropriate depending on your point of view. And yeah, they are very diverse in their kind of displays. Like there are certain mannequins that display as part of their display. They'll kind of raise their wings very quickly and kind of clap them together above their backs. And like doing this, like they have some of the fastest muscles of like probably like any vertebrate at least to allow them to like snap their wings really quickly and make these noises to kind of attract females as part of their display. There are some that display in groups, like they actually do like a sort of collaborative kind of display. So what happens is that there's this dominant male in the group who leads the sort of dance, and he's accompanied by some younger males who are sort of like apprentices, and then they all perform the dance together. But in the end, only if they're successful, only the dominant male gets to mate with whatever females show up. However, when the dominant male is eventually, driven away or dies, one of the subordinate apprentices will become the new dominant male, and then he'll eventually get a chance to mate, or that's the hope at least. And so, yeah, they have this really complex kind of social relationships and that involve these really complex displays. Yeah.
You'd think something called a mannequin would actually like be like a still like unmoving bird.
Right. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure where they get their name, to be honest. Yeah, that'll be something good to look up later. But yeah, no, they are very lively, at least during the courtship displays. Yeah. And then we also see like very elaborate displays in this next group as well, the Cotingas. And you can see here that this is a cock of the rock, which is very colorful, another very colorful male here. And yeah, we also see some very odd displays in this group too, and some very interesting display structures. Like the cock of the rock has almost all of its face like hidden under this crest of feathers, for example. Yeah, yeah. And then there are like species called the umbrella birds, which have this also very elaborate feather crest that kind of hangs over their head like an umbrella. And in at least one species, it's also accompanied by this long, remarkable feather wattle that can kind of be raised. It looks almost like a very long pine cone. Like if you imagine the scales on a pine cone, like it can raise the feathers like all around its like long feather wattle, and it looks like a big pine cone like that. It's very weird. There's a species called the capuchin bird or the calf bird, where it has like this bare blue face, but then it also has this like orange ruff around its neck that comes all the way up to the base of its head. So it looks really weird. And they make these super weird noises when they're calling for their to attract mates. And yeah, they also like to gather in like these big groups where like many males are like competing for the attention of the females. And yeah, it's quite remarkable. And in fact, I would probably consider like things like the mannequin and the Cotingas to be like the American version of like birds of paradise. So we're
Yeah.
yeah, like we haven't covered birds of paradise yet because they belong to a different group. Um, but of course, birds of paradise are very famous for their super elaborate kind of courtship behavior by the males and their very elaborate courtship structures, like display structures that they have. And they certainly get a lot of press for it. But I think the cotingas and mannequins don't get enough credit for that because they do very similar things, and they also have evolved very elaborate kind of displays in the American tropics. And they do it in kind of ecosystems where predators are a lot more diverse and abundant compared to the kind of the island of New Guinea where the birds of paradise are primarily found. So yeah, that's pretty impressive, and probably the reason they've been able to evolve these elaborate display structures is pretty similar to the birds of paradise in that they live in these tropical forests where food is abundant. So both of these groups, the cotingas and the mannequins, are primarily fruit eaters, and so fruit is of course abundant pretty much year round in these tropical forests, and so they can actually expend like all this energy just displaying and evolving all these super elaborate courtship rituals. And probably being in this kind of environment helps drive that kind of evolution, and then evolving into these really cool kind of super visually elaborate displays that we see now and are a frequent subject of documentaries.
Hmm.
And then the next group on here is called the Titirids, which include a number of different species, the Titiras and the mourners and so on. And they don't really have a collective name yet because a lot of the members of this group were thought to belong to like different groups of Suboscines in the past, and so they're kind of recently recognized group that have only been like recently gathered together. Like, oh, this is a group of birds that exists. But yeah, they're mostly like tree dwelling birds that feed on insects, small vertebrates, fruit, and things like that. Something that's pretty unusual is that there are a couple of species that are called mourners, where their young mimic poisonous caterpillars. Yeah,
Oh.
this is pretty odd. So the adults of these birds, the mourners, are pretty drab looking, like they're kind of grayish brownish birds that don't look too remarkable. But their nestlings, their babies, um, hatch out with this remarkable kind of orange fuzz like all over them, and it kind of sticks up in like all these directions. And
Hmm.
it turns out that this kind of feather arrangement and the look of these feathers looks a lot like a particular species of orange caterpillar that's very hairy and poisonous that lives in the same ecosystem. And so it seems that the babies of these birds pretend to be poisonous caterpillars to kind of avoid being attacked by predators. And
That's
yeah,
so cool.
yeah,
You'd think it'd be the other way around with caterpillars.
right. Yeah, like imagine that, like a bird pretending to be a caterpillar. It's so weird and so amazing. And then finally, a very diverse group are the tyrant flycatchers, and yeah, there are hundreds of species of tyrant flycatchers. Um, and they are not only very diverse, but they are also very widespread. So they can not only be found in South America and the tropical regions of the Americas, but also in northern North America as well. And so you might be familiar with some of them if you live in northern North America. So things like the phoebes, the kingbirds, and the peewees are members of the tyrant flycatchers, and we're going to meet a large number of different passeriform groups that are called flycatchers, and the reason for that is pretty obvious. They mostly catch flying insects; that's their main source of food, and the way they catch them is the kind of perch and wait style that we've kind of described already, where they kind of sit on perches, and then when they see an insect they want to catch, they quickly fly out and catch them in midair. And so that's why they're called flycatchers. But why are they called tyrants? Well, the reason for that, and this is how the larger groups like Tyrannida and Tyrannides got their names. They're named after the tyrant flycatchers. The reason for that is because a lot of these tyrant flycatchers, even though they're pretty small birds, they are very aggressive towards predators. So if they see like a bird of prey, for example, they'll quickly fly out and like harass the bird of prey, and they'll like swoop at it from behind, like sometimes even landing on top of it, or like pulling at its feathers and things. and then they'll relentlessly kind of mob the predator until it goes away. And because of that, they have been called the tyrant flycatchers. And particularly the species called kingbirds are especially notable for this behavior, and that's the reason they are called kingbirds. And yeah, the tyrant flycatchers are, they span a pretty broad range of sizes. Like there are very small ones, there are some bigger ones, and based on their sizes, they can take like pretty different types of prey, from like very small flying insects to, in some cases, small vertebrates if they feel like it. So yeah, they're a very diverse and successful group, and they aren't always the most colorful. Some of them are actually pretty colorful, like the vermilion flycatcher, for example, is this bright red. The males are, at least. But many of them aren't too flashy. But if you pay attention, you can often see them perched on like fairly obvious perches. I think most of the ones we have in northern North America, um, they are they're migratory. So at least in the kind of temperate regions, you'll see them around in summer, but they'll leave for more warmer climates in the winter. However, yeah, if you pay close attention while they're around, you can often see species like the phoebes and the kingbirds. Um, yeah, definitely a pretty cool group of birds, and definitely kind of the North American contingent of the Suboscines, because since most of their diversity is found further south.
Mm.
Um, Alrighty, should we go on to the Ferneridans? Do you have anything to add?
Uh, yeah, I guess I'll just add like
Mm-hmm.
while the tyrant flycatchers are present in North America, that's not a group of songbirds that I'm used to seeing that much,
Mm-hmm.
surprisingly.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
may have heard a phoebe once or twice, but
Right,
I wouldn't have known what it was.
right.
Unfortunately, birdsong is not my best strength.
Sure. Learning bird songs is hard. Like I cannot say that I'm very good at identifying birds by call. Like I'm not at all. It takes a lot of practice and experience to be very good at it. Um, and yeah, like I said, the tyrant flycatchers we tend to get in like eastern North America. They tend to be not very colorful and not very flashy. So they're often not easy to like notice at first glance. I think they can be pretty easy to see. Like they perch in pretty obvious places, but they might not be something that you'll immediately notice as like being present there. So yeah, they definitely aren't the most obvious birds. But I think if you know what to look for, and if you're in suitable habitat, they'll probably be around.
Yeah. I imagine if you want to learn bird songs, you just get one of those like Birds of North America
Right.
CDs. Just listen to it on a loop day after
Right,
day
right.
until it just gets in your head.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to do it. I think potentially pretty helpful too. Definitely a lot of the bird calls that I know were learned from experience, like just hearing the
Mm.
call and then doing my best to track down the bird, and then trying to memorize that. But that definitely takes a lot of time, and takes a lot of effort and many sessions of birding to be able to get a good sense of that. So yeah,
Right.
yeah
They have
yeah.
some really cool little devices. I remember there's a
Mm,
museum in Maine that I love to go to, the L.C. Bates Museum, and in the bird room,
yeah.
they would have these out for like people to like use.
Oh yeah.
They look like Pokedexes almost, but you slide in like a little like baseball card with a bunch of different birds,
Mhm.
and next to each bird on the device is a button. And when
Uh,
you put the card in the device, when it's turned on and like it recognizes, oh, this is that card, then you push the button and it says the name of the bird and the bird's song.
yeah. Mm.
And so it's kind of like a see and visual like
Right, right.
connection kind of thing that you can use. And I thought
Yeah,
that was always pretty cool.
that is pretty cool. Yeah, for sure. And I do know that there are a few websites and even apps out there that help people identify bird songs.
Yeah.
I know in some cases, like you can even like upload like a recording of a bird song, and like some of those websites or apps might even try to help you identify them. So and from what I hear, like in some cases, like they can be pretty effective. Um, so yeah, definitely if you're interested in birding by ear, check out some of those resources for sure.
Yeah.
Alrighty then. Let's also look at the Ferneridans on the next slide. So this is a very diverse group as well, but definitely a lot less familiar to North Americans because they're all mostly found south of Mexico. But they are definitely extremely diverse. Um, So let's have a look. Unlike the tyrannidans, most of these are more ground-dwelling birds. Now there is variation though, because they are so diverse. But yeah, you'll see them mostly like close to or on the ground. Um, and yeah, they seem to be a lot more into those close to the ground niches. For example, the gnat eaters on here, they tend to perch in like low vegetation and then look for like insects down below, and then they'll kind of go down and pounce on insects from like above. Um, there's a group here called the antbirds, and they're called that because of their very distinctive behavior, where many of the species are specialists in following army ants. Yeah, so like these tropical ants that just march through the forest and, well, and basically take down anything in their path, pretty much. Now, there's a fair bit of I guess fear mongering, I guess, about army ants. Usually for large animals, it's pretty easy to get out of the way of these army ant colonies. So things like humans don't usually get caught up in them, uh, but definitely for small animals, things like other arthropods or small vertebrates, things like frogs and lizards, like army ants are terrifying. That's there's no doubt about that. And so when army ants are on the march, like all these other small animals, many of them are like scrambling to get out of the way and making sure that they are not on the menu for these army ants. And so what these antbirds will do is that they'll like kind of accompany. They're like patrons of the army ants. They'll stay around on the sidelines where these ants are marching through. And as all these like smaller animals are trying to get out of the way, the antbirds will come down and grab these fleeing animals. So yeah, the that's kind of the main way of foraging for a lot of the species of antbirds. Um, and something also pretty interesting is that antbirds also form the centers of mixed species of foraging flocks. And what this means is that a lot of the time, many other types of tropical birds will actually gather around these antbirds, and then they all kind of forage in the same spot together. And a lot of the time they're concentrating on like slightly different types of food sources or using like different foraging methods, so they often don't get in each other's way. But being together like this often helps them kind of have more eyes to be on the lookout for predators, for example. Um, and the antbirds kind of form the center of these flocks because these other birds, like a lot of the time, some of them are just passing through and happen to be in the area, and other times, if the antbirds aren't around, they wouldn't be hanging out together and they would disperse. But a lot of times, it seems to be because the antbirds are present and know where the good food is, that they form these gatherings of big mixed species flocks. And it's pretty interesting because a lot of times these antbirds will hold territories, right? And so sometimes these antbirds will encounter other antbirds near the border of the territories with their own accompanying mixed species foraging flocks. And when this happens, like the species in those flocks will like get into arguments with the same species that are on the different territory, kind of defending the territory from their own species on the other side. But like they don't go after like the other species in the other flocks. They just kind of divide up to like fight these the different parts of the flock on the opposing territory when this happens, which is kind of an interesting kind of behavior that happens because of the antbirds are forming this nucleus of these foraging flocks. Yeah. They're the ones that kind of unite all the other species behind them, basically, which is pretty cool. Then we have a group called the ant pittas, and they're kind of similar to like the pittas from the Afro-Eurasian Suboscines that we talked about before. They're kind of these pretty leggy birds that run around in the on the forest floor. They're not as colorful as the pittas are, but they probably live in a pretty similar way. And then we have a group called the Tapaculos, another mostly ground-dwelling group. They don't like to fly very much. In fact, many of them have very reduced flight capabilities. They actually dig burrows to nest in on the ground, and they're pretty diverse. And they are pretty mousy little birds, I guess. Yeah, they kind of behave a lot like mice. They're kind of running around on the ground, like darting into crevices and things like that. And then finally, we have a super diverse group, also composed of hundreds of species, called the ovenbirds. And the ovenbirds are really diverse. They really defy kind of generalization. There are many different ecologies. They include some of the few species of passeriform birds that live on coastlines, for example, and they kind of just scavenge from like rock pools and things like that. They also include species that are super specialized for like one specific type of tree, like they only live in like one specific species of tree, things like that. Yeah, they come in many different forms. You might wonder why they're called ovenbirds, and the reason is that some of the species called horneros, build these nests as pictured here. So they build these nests out of mud, and they can be many times their own body weight when the mud is fully hardened. And because they apparently look like ovens to some people, and because they are this big chamber with like this big entrance. And so that's the reason that this entire group is called the ovenbirds. However, not all of them do this. Like not all of them build nests like this. They are very diverse in their nesting behavior as well. So yeah, they really defy like kind of easy generalization. And a point of caution and kind of relating to the problem of common names is that there actually is a North American bird called the ovenbird. Um, which is not a member of this group at all. It is actually a songbird, and we'll get to the group that it belongs to way later. But yeah, the North American bird called the ovenbird is not an ovenbird. Sorry, I didn't come up with these names. But yeah, okay. But anyways, yeah, there's a super diverse group of tropical American birds called the ovenbirds that does not include the ovenbird. But anyways, yes. Um, yeah, very diverse group. There are also like species that like climb up tree trunks, for example, and have these really long decurved bills. These are called the wood creepers, I think. Not to be confused with the tree creepers, which behave very similarly but live in different ecosystems. Yeah, yeah, you'll see like all this kind of parallelism going on within the passeriform birds, like lots of independent evolutions into very similar niches on different continents. But yeah, in any case, what you need to know here is that the Phaneridans are a very diverse group of Suboscine birds, mostly not very colorful species, but definitely an important part of their ecosystems, and very diverse in both species count and their ecology. And in fact, because a lot of these birds are pretty difficult to study because they live in these dense forests. A lot of them aren't very brightly colored. This is actually a group of birds where we're still discovering new species. Like pretty recently, there have been like new species of antbirds and tapaculos that have been described that were previously unknown to science. And so, yeah, this is a group of birds which we are still learning lots more about. All right. Do you have anything to add before we go on?
Yeah, I guess just to clarify about the ovenbirds a little bit.
Yeah.
So, the ornero, like the oven, so like there's a scene in the Three
Oh
Caballeros
yeah.
where they talk about these birds. It's like an introduction into the Gauchito sequence,
Yeah.
which is it's a story about this little boy who finds like a donkey Pegasus. That's a whole nother thing. But on the boy's house is an ovenbird, an ornero doing a nest, and the nest is shaped almost exactly like an earth oven that the gauchos use
Right.
on the
That's
South
right.
American pampas. And so they kind of open up with that, like, oh, look at the little bird. It has the oven, just like my oven. And oh, look, there's me as a little boy, as he's telling the story. So,
Oh, nice. Yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Oh, that's pretty neat that they featured that. Alrighty, so let's continue onward, and to the next major group of passeriform birds. So we looked at the New Zealand wrens and we looked at the Suboscines, and now we're going to look at the final, or well, third major lineage, the songbirds, also called the Oscines. Now the term songbird is sometimes used for like all passeriforms. You'll definitely see that sometimes. Um, but I think it is more precise to use it for specifically the Oscine passeriform birds, and this is because this is the group where we see a lot of the complex song going on, as we shall cover on this slide.
mm.
Um, Now, some of those very early passeriform fossils, some of those early Suboscine fossils from Europe, from like the late Oligocene, have been found alongside songbird fossils. So those are some of the oldest known examples of songbirds and Suboscines in the same ecosystems. But we actually have also some very old songbird fossils from Australia, which again will come into play a bit later. Um, so yeah, Oligocene onwards we find the songbird fossils, and the songbirds really represent like the majority of passeriform diversity. They can be found everywhere except for Antarctica, and there are over 5,000 species. So the songbirds alone are roughly half of all bird diversity.
Wow.
Yeah. All right, so yeah, well, what are some of the features that distinguish songbirds anyway? One of the main features that have long been recognized as a hallmark of songbirds is a very complex syrinx. So the syrinx is a vocal organ of birds. It's a set of cartilages and membranes and muscles found near the base of the windpipe, where the windpipe is about to branch out into the two lungs. This is where the syrinx is, and the syrinx is found in nearly all living birds, and is what they use to make their vocalizations. And the way it works is essentially that there are, in a very simplified explanation, is essentially that there are these membranes that on the along the sides of the windpipe, and sometimes along the sides of the bronchi as well, the two branches that are branching out into the lungs, and as there's actually an air sac that goes around the region of the syrinx, and as the air sac expands, it actually pushes on the membranes along the sides of the syrinx, and it kind of squeezes the windpipe or the bronchi a little bit, and then when that happens, it kind of restricts the airway a bit, and it allows and causes sound to be made as it rushes through the windpipe. Because the syrinx is situated at this branching point here, it is possible in many cases for birds to actually make two different vocalizations at the same time using the two different sides of the two different bronchi. So that's something pretty cool, and allows birds to make very complex calls. And so in most birds, there are kind of there's like a pair of muscles that's associated with the syrinx, at least one pair at least, and so they also kind of pull on the parts of the syrinx that also to help modulate the sound that comes out. But in songbirds, the musculature around the syrinx is very complex. There's more than just one pair. There are like many different pairs of muscles that are associated with this region. And probably related to this is that they allow the songbirds to produce very intricate, very complex vocalizations that are, in many cases, associated with courtship. And specifically, these intricate and often musical sounding vocalizations that are associated with courtship are what we call bird song. A lot of ornithologists draw a distinction between like calls and song, and song is often specifically like these very complex musical sounding vocalizations that are produced for the purposes of courtship, for attracting mates, and calls are a lot of just the other types of vocalizations that are often simpler that birds can produce. Now there's this idea, and in fact, this was kind of the mainstream idea in the scientific community for a long time, that only male songbirds produce song. And while this is true of a lot of the songbirds that live in temperate environments, and this is probably the reason why there was this kind of mainstream view of it, because of course a very westernized, Western-centric viewpoint. European and North American scientists observe the songbirds around them and say, oh, it's mostly the males that are producing song in these species. However, a lot of recent research has found that actually female song is also very widespread in songbirds. And it turns out that probably ancestrally, songbirds ancestrally all exhibited both female and male song, and probably actually for pretty similar reasons. So there's a lot we don't know about female bird song because it has been so understudied. However, it does seem from the preliminary research that has been done that female bird song in the songbirds where it is present may serve in large part a very similar function to male bird song, that is to attract mates. And so we're probably seeing here another example of mutual sexual selection where both the males and the females produce elaborate kind of courtship displays, in this case of vocal displays, and they both select each other on the basis of this. So it's not a very one-sided kind of affair as is often stereotypically depicted. And so, yeah, the songbirds have all these very complex vocalizations, and they're often musical sounding, but not always. For example, corvids, the crows and their relatives, are songbirds, and they can produce very complex vocalizations. But of course, people don't usually consider like the cawing of a crow or the croaking of a raven to be very musical sounding, but they are still members of the songbirds. And also related to this is that a lot of these complex vocalizations are learned vocalizations. Like the birds do not know these songs innately. They are capable of vocal learning, and we talked about vocal learning previously with the parrots. Parrots are also capable of vocal learning. And of course, that raises a question, well, if parrots and songbirds are both capable of vocal learning, like learning different vocalizations and then repeating them back, is this ancestral to all of the psittacopedids? And the answer to that is it's a bit complicated because most of these Suboscines don't seem to exhibit vocal learning, but there is a bit of evidence that some of them might. So, it could be that the capability of vocal learning, like the potential for vocal learning, is present ancestrally in psittacopedids, but maybe it became elaborated independently in the parrots and in the songbirds, and maybe in some of the Suboscines too. But in any case, this is a very common trait to all the songbirds, is this vocal learning ability, and that yeah they know some of their calls innately, but their complex courtship songs they need to learn from other individuals, and sometimes it can be from their parents, but other times they will pick up songs from essentially their neighbors. Like when a young songbird is striking out on its own and is ready to kind of stake out its own territory, it'll find a place and then it'll listen to how the other birds around it are singing and then learn those songs. And then in that way, we actually get like kind of geographical dialects of in a single songbird species, where the songbirds from one region, even if they're the same species, will sing slightly different songs from those of a different region, and they kind of develop like these dialects and accents like that. It's really interesting, and there is a lot of research that has been done on like how songbirds learn song, like the kind of neuroscience under there that underlies the process, like the brain processes that are going on there, and variation in song learning in different geographic regions and different species and all that. And we don't have time to go into that here. And honestly, like I mentioned this before, but I'm not much of a neuroscientist anyway, so I'm probably not the best person to try and explain all the intricate details there. But yeah, I will say that that information is heavily researched, and it's definitely out there if you're interested in learning more about that. And of course, because of the parallels to humans, how we learn language, there's a lot of interest in studying this subject in how songbirds learn song because of these parallels. And there does seem from the research that has been done that there are some pretty interesting convergences in how songbirds learn their song and how we humans learn our language. So yeah, kind of that is a pretty cool aspect of this research. And finally, something quite recently discovered that doesn't really have to do with vocalization so much is that it turns out that ancestrally it seems that songbirds are capable of perceiving sweetness, the taste of sweetness. And that is actually pretty unusual for birds. And yeah, that might seem weird to us because, of course, tasting sweetness seems normal to us. However, it is actually pretty common in especially carnivorous animals to lose the taste of sweetness because a meat-eating animal doesn't really encounter many situations where it needs to perceive sweet much, right? You can imagine that they're mostly eating meat, which doesn't really have much sweetness to it. And it has been hypothesized that since birds evolved from carnivorous dinosaurs, that they probably lost the taste of sweetness very early on. That they lost the ability to perceive sweetness very early on. And indeed, most living birds are actually that aren't songbirds are not capable of perceiving sweetness. But we do know of a few groups of birds that can, and one of these groups, of course, is the hummingbirds, which primarily feed on like sugary sweet nectar, and so it makes sense why they would have re-evolved the ability to perceive sweetness. And in a recent study, ornithologists, researchers looked at taste receptors in songbirds because a lot of songbirds like to eat sweet foods like fruits and nectar, and we'll see a lot of examples of nectar eating songbirds. Like it makes sense if they would be able to perceive sweetness as well. And so, in a recent study that was published like a couple months ago, something like that, maybe even last month, it was found that it turns out that the ability to taste sweetness is very widespread in songbirds, and so it's very likely that very close to the last common ancestor of songbirds, the ability to taste sweetness re-evolved in this group. If I had to guess, like I would guess that maybe the parrots can as well, because parrots also often eat sugary foods. But I don't think that research has been done in detail. However, yeah, with the songbirds, it was recently discovered that yes, sweetness, the ability to taste sweetness, is very widespread, and that also ties into kind of the origins of songbirds, because as we will cover in more detail in a moment, it seems that songbirds originated in Australia, and we mentioned this in the last episode that Australia is this weird kind of ecosystem, or it has a set of very weird ecosystems where the plants produce a lot of sugar-rich resources. The plants produce a lot of sugar-rich nectar and sap and so on, and there are insects that feed on these exudates that also kind of shed all this excess sugar. And so there are a lot of Australian songbirds that are specialized for feeding on these sugary food sources. And so it probably makes a lot of sense that ancestrally they would become capable of perceiving sweetness. And this has been retained in many, many songbird lineages. So yeah, that is pretty interesting. Okay, anything to add before we go on?
Not particularly.
Alrighty, so let's continue and start diving into the phylogeny of songbirds. And yeah, this is going to be pretty elaborate, but let's see what we can do here. Alright, so you'll see that in the songbirds, there are a whole series of clades here. So we have the lyrebirds, the bowerbirds, fairy wrens, thornbills, honey eaters, and the Australasian babblers. And there are some groups here that I left out. That all are restricted to Australia. So, that is interesting. And so each of these groups are pretty distinctive in their behavior and their ecology. So I'll briefly kind of go through them. So we talked about lyrebirds previously on one of our news episodes because they are especially well known for their ability for vocal mimicry. That, of course, ties into the vocal learning ability that's shared by pretty much all songbirds. So there are actually many types of songbirds that are capable of vocal mimicry, mimicking the sounds that they hear. But lyrebirds seem to be especially elaborate about doing this. Like they will incorporate a lot of the sounds that they hear into their courtship calls, for example. And it seems that maybe the more complex the song that they can produce, the more effective they are at attracting mates, perhaps. They're super elaborate. We talked more about them in that particular news episode, maybe I should link it in the description. But yeah, very very impressive. You should look up some videos of lyrebirds mimicking sounds. It should be said that they are famous for being able to mimic like human-made sounds like chainsaws and cars and whatnot, and they are capable of doing this, but it has primarily been recorded in captive birds, so it's not normally found in wild birds. They're more likely to imitate sounds of like other animals in their environment in the wild, but nonetheless it tells you something about how versatile their vocal mimicry abilities are. And then we have the bowerbirds, which they are also pretty elaborate mimics, but they're more famous for kind of attracting mates in a different way. And that is the bowerbirds will build these structures called bowers for attracting mates. And for example, you can see here in the photo, the satin bowerbird has built this kind of two parallel, uh, series of wall-like structures that are next to each other, and then kind of decorated this with a lot of blue objects. Yeah, they deliberately choose like specific colors sometimes to decorate these bowers with, and they use these structures for attracting mates, and that's pretty much all they're used for. Like these bowers are not used as nests or anything. They are entirely built by the males to show off to the females. They I'm a high quality male, so yeah, that's a very distinctive behavior that they have. Um, and we have the fairy wrens, which, as you might expect, are not actually wrens, but they do kind of look a little bit like wrens. They tend to be a lot more brightly colored, however, and especially the males. And so, yeah, you can see how distinctive they are here. I saw a few species of fairy wrens while I was in Australia for that
Ooh.
one Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference, and yeah, they are amazing to see in person. Um, then there are the thornbills, which are a pretty diverse group of. They're sometimes called the Australasian warblers because they behave a bit like species that are called warblers from other parts of the world. They're kind of these small insect eaters for most part, occupying a wide variety of different environments. Um, there are the honey eaters, which, as their name suggests, they don't feed on honey exactly, but they are very specialized for feeding on nectar, and so these are some of the nectar specialists I kind of alluded to earlier. And yeah, honey eaters are also another very diverse group. And then we have Australasian babblers, and so called because they kind of resemble another group of songbirds I will get to later called the babblers that are not found in Australasia. So yeah, you can see how these sort of Eurocentric names came about because Europeans, when they first got to Australia, saw all these species that were kind of similar to the Afro-Eurasian species that they were familiar with, and oh, that's an Australian version of this, or and so on, even if they're not actually that closely related. Um, and yeah, something that is common among a lot of these Australasian songbirds is cooperative breeding. So a lot of the time, this isn't really found in the lyrebirds and bowerbirds so much, but in a lot of the other groups here, um, they basically rely on like not just the parents, the two parents, to take care of the young, but also helpers at the nest. And a lot of time, these helper birds are like last year's young, for example, or at least young from a previous brood that are sticking around to help rear their younger siblings, and they form these very tight social structures. So yeah, these family groups, and yeah, that's a pretty distinctive feature of Australian songbirds. Some of the songbirds from other parts of the world do this too, but it does seem to be a behavior that's particularly prominent in Australia. And we kind of talked about last time reasons why this might be, like the kind of stiff competition over resources, for example, that drives this kind of the evolution of this kind of behavior. And then we have two big groups of songbirds, the Corvideans and the Passeriforms. And you can think of these as the group closer to crows and to sparrows, and the group closer to sparrows than to crows, essentially. And they both form two very elaborate diversification events that made their way outside of Australasia. So, let's see. Do you have anything to add before we go on?
Not really.
Alrighty. And I'll just mention as a final thing that a lot of these Australasian groups do now have identified fossil records from Australia. Now, unfortunately, Australia does not have a very good fossil record like from the Eocene, but from the Oligocene onwards, we actually have fossil representatives of a lot of these Australian songbird groups, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, a lot of that is thanks to the research of Dr. Jackie Nguyen, um, who has kind of done a lot of the research necessary to work out what a lot of these fossil songbirds in Australia are. Because since we now think songbirds originated in Australia, it has become a pretty big deal to try and identify what these fossil songbirds from Australia actually are. And it turns out that a lot of them actually belong to these Australian groups that we recognize today, and so they've been evolving there for quite a long time. All right, so on the next slide, we kind of show the kind of biogeographic history of songbirds. Um, and so this was basically a phylogenetic study that was done, and they estimated the timing of when these diversification events happened within the songbird group, and then tried to estimate where ancestrally these songbirds were found. Um, Now, historically, even I would say, barely historically, like pretty recently, um, the biogeographic history of passeriform birds and the timing of events in their evolution has been rather fraught with controversy, I think. Prior to major genetic studies, I don't think anybody expected that Australia would be kind of the birthplace of the songbirds. Like, the traditional kind of stereotypical idea of songbirds were that these were the quote unquote highest of all birds, most advanced of all birds. There's no way that, these are colonialist attitudes. So there's no way that, some place like Australia with all its failures of like wildlife that can't be found anywhere else, would be like the birthplace of the most advanced group of birds on Earth, and a very good documentation of like this history, and how these social prejudices have influenced our understanding of songbird evolution can be found in Tim Lowe's book, Where Song Began, which I also mentioned last time. So yeah, check that out if you want more details on that. But basically, yeah, there was this bias against Australia. They thought, certainly, we Western scientists seem to think that a lot of these animals were just failures that couldn't make it anywhere else, and that's why they're kind of stuck on this island continent. But then the genetic studies came in, and people started to find that, oh wait, there's this whole series of Australasian groups that are, that form the outgroups to the songbirds that we're familiar with from other parts of the world. And that seems to hint at the fact that the common ancestor of all songbirds might have actually come from Australia. And of course, it's met with some pushback over the years, but now we are pretty confident that this is the case, because there have been many more phylogenetic studies done since then, and they always come out with this result. And I did mention in a previous episode about how we need to take into account the fossil record when we are considering, ancestral ranges of animals. And so far, the fossil record hasn't really contradicted this, because the oldest known passeriform fossils, like I said, the oldest known crowned passeriform fossils are from Australia, and the oldest known songbird fossils are also from Australia as well. So it does seem that is definitely the songbirds, at least, and probably passeriforms in general, did originally evolve in Australia. And it is not until the Oligocene that we start seeing fossils of them outside of Australia. So yeah. Now, even after we're starting to accept this, then there was the controversies about timing of evolution, and I've kind of touched on this many times in this series. I think about kind of controversies about when crown birds evolved, but a lot of this was driven, I think, in part by perceptions about how passeriform birds evolved, because again, we now know that the New Zealand wrens, which are only found in New Zealand today, are the sister group to all the other passeriform birds, right? And so there was this idea that, oh, so clearly the New Zealand wrens split from the other passeriform birds back when New Zealand split away from the other southern continents. That would have been during the Cretaceous. And so, yeah, people would run these divergence time analyses, but they would specify to the analyses that, okay, we want the diversification of the New Zealand wrens splitting away from the other passeriforms, at least during the Cretaceous, at the very latest, because that was when New Zealand split, so that made sense. And so you would have these really ancient divergence time results, where you have like crown passeriforms like diverging all the way back in the Cretaceous, and of course that pulls all the other crown bird groups back down in the Cretaceous as well, even though there's basically no fossil evidence for this whatsoever. And yeah, so that was a whole thing. But then people came around and were like, wait a minute, birds can fly, right? So So it's not necessarily the case that New Zealand wrens split from the others all the way back in the Cretaceous. Um, and even though New Zealand wrens, in recent times are not great flyers over long distances, that doesn't mean that necessarily that they've always been that way or that their ancestors have always been that way. That's definitely not something we can assume. Uh, and so when people started running analyses where they don't assume that this split happened all the way back in the late Cretaceous, they find that crown passeriforms probably first appeared much later during the Cenozoic. And so this was one of the earliest studies. The figure that this came from was one of the earliest studies to kind of revise these divergence time estimates about when songbirds evolved and diversified and left Australia. And so what they found was that it seems that the dispersion of songbirds outside of Australia approximately coincides with the formation of a series of islands, basically the Wallaceian Islands, of Southeast Asia and near Papua New Guinea. So basically, it seems that during the Oligocene to Miocene, as these islands formed, more and more lineages of songbirds started to disperse outside of Australia, and probably using these islands as kind of stepping stones along the way. And so eventually they would go on to disperse all over the world and become very successful, as we see today. And morning soundscapes would never sound the same after that. So yeah, this is our basically our current model of when and how songbirds evolved, and I think it makes a lot of sense for this kind of dispersion to have occurred, coincided with the formation of the Wallaceian Islands. And so far, subsequent studies that have been done are pretty much consistent with this as well. And so, yeah, that's that kind of tells us more about the dispersion of the songbirds. Now, with the just for the record, I guess with the Suboscines, things are less clear. So we do think that passeriforms in general probably originate in Australia because the New Zealand wrens are over there in New Zealand, and as we mentioned before on the show, New Zealand is kind of the spin-off world of Australia, right? So things that kind of get blown away from Australia kind of often end up in New Zealand, and so it is quite likely that the common ancestor of all passeriforms was also an Australian bird. But yeah, because just because of the incompleteness of the fossil record, especially for the very early kind of history of passeriform birds, like during the Eocene or so, we don't have much of a record there in Australia. We don't know much about like the timing of how Suboscines got out of Australia. So yeah, that's still kind of a mystery gap there. But yeah, certainly with the songbirds, it seems that their dispersion lines up pretty well with the formation of these islands. Do you have anything to add?
I guess just two quick things.
Yeah.
One's more of an observation than anything. Um, I mean, New Zealand's history is very fascinating, and I
Mm.
think even more so nowadays since we've been able to confirm that those islands were originally part of a larger continent
Yep.
called the Zealandia,
That's right.
which it also included, I think, New Caledonia among some other islands. Now, I forget when most of that land was supposed to have been
Mm.
submerged in the prehistoric past. And I'm very curious, like, what that means for a lot of our, I guess, imagery of prehistoric New Zealand. Like,
Right.
would there have been a lot more land for all of these different birds? I guess depending on when that landmass is supposed to have been there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah. That's also a bit of a mystery there too, because yeah, the early history, like the Paleogene history of New Zealand, is also not very well known. Um, and we do know that in more recent times there was another episode of like submersion, mostly under the water, for the New Zealand islands. Like it has been called the New Zealand inundation event. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, it is pretty hard to say how the fauna was affected by this just because of the incompleteness of the record. Like we don't really have much older than the Miocene or so for New Zealand. We do have stuff from the Paleocene, but like in between that and the Miocene, there's this huge gap there, and yeah, we're not sure exactly what went on um, in that time. Um, so yeah, it is pretty curious. Like it does seem that some of these groups that have been on New Zealand for a while, things like the New Zealand wrens, for example, um, they they might have survived the inundation event. So that probably occurred in like the Oligocene or so, the
Hmm.
inundation of New Zealand. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard. Like for all we know, they could have arrived later because the oldest fossils are like early Miocene. But people have argued that we since we see that the New Zealand wrens, for example, had already diversified pretty heavily by the early Miocene, that maybe they were there for longer and they made it through like this Oligocene
Right.
inundation. Um, but yeah, definitely another open question there, and something we hopefully can find the rocks of the right age to tell us more about.
Okay, yeah. No, that is interesting to think about. Just blank pages in the
Right.
record of the rocks.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'll just like a quick observation. I think it's interesting. Like this particular chart,
Yeah.
the little world map below that they use the biogeographic
Yeah.
regions as their categories, which is interesting because I believe those, I guess, delineations of the Earth's surface were originally used in an ornithology context. Like
Right. Right.
you were looking at bird distributions to make like the Afrotropical or the
Right.
Holarctic zones and that sort of thing. And then they just kind of started using that for other organisms that
Yeah.
here, because like I've known about these for a while now, but I've never bothered to look and see like are they still like considered fairly, what's the word I'm looking for, like a serious point of discussion in biology, or are they kind of like a thing of the past more than anything?
I think they're generally still used, like if only for convenience purposes. But I would say roughly that these do correspond fairly well to like general biogeographic realms, I suppose. Like there, you probably do find like fairly distinct um, faunas and floras depending on these regions. But yeah, like with a lot of things like this, I'm sure like there are gradients between them and all of that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. And so yeah, so two major groups of songbirds that have dispersed outside of Australasia, and they probably did it independently because both of them do still contain um, what seems to be lineages that have stayed in Australasia since those ancestral times. Um, so one group is Corvides, and the other group is Passerides, and we'll look first at the Corvids. So this is a clade closer to crows than to sparrows. Um, so all right, here's a sampling of their diversity. So for example, a lot of these groups are still pretty diverse in Australasia, even though some of them might have made their way outside of it. Um, so things like the cuckoo shrikes and the whistlers and the orioles and the butcherbirds and the wood swallows. They all still have an Australasian presence. And you can see that a lot of the members of Corvidae, um, they have like relatively large bills for their body size. You can see that pretty well across the board here. And so a lot of them are fairly uh, they're omnivorous or predatory, like, and they're capable of taking like pretty large prey items relative to their body size. So a lot of them will hunt large insects, small vertebrates, things like that. But many of them will also eat fruits as well. So yeah, and wherever they go, they seem that seems to be a role that they often adopt. Um, and so a few particular groups do, I guess, particularly highlight here. The Vireos are a group that have made it into North America, into the Americas in general, I should say. and they are they are pretty I would say they're a pretty underappreciated group because most of them are pretty drably colored, and they're not very noticeable because they they're mostly insect-eating birds, but unlike a lot of insect-eating birds, they don't have a lot of that frenetic kind of energy. A lot of like small insectivorous songbirds are like very active. They'll like just dart around from branch to branch and like peck at things and just feeding all the time. Um, and you can see them like being very active while you're watching them like in the forest or such. Whereas vireos and like a lot of the members of Corvidae, um, they tend to be a lot more sedate. Like they kind of creep slowly along the branches more deliberately and kind of search at a more sedate kind of pace. And probably in part because of that, they are not very noticeable birds, and so they often go overlooked. But they're definitely not. Most of them are not rare birds, I would say. Like I've definitely seen them occasionally while I was in the States. So yeah, they're also one of those groups that are like they're out there if you know where to look for them, kind of things. Um, and yeah, they're not the most visually kind of interesting birds to look at, but yeah, they're a pretty cool group of birds biogeographically because they are the only group within the subgroup of Corvidae called the orioles that have dispersed into the Americas. Um, Now the whistlers and the orioles are pretty interesting. Oh, by the way, another warning with common names. In the Americas, we do have some birds called orioles, like the Baltimore oriole, the state bird of Maryland. Um, but these are not members of the true Oriole group that aren't members of Corvides. Yeah, the American Orioles are actually members of Passerides, and we will get to them much later. So yeah, they are not closely related to the Orioles that are found on this slide at all. So the true Orioles are a strictly like Afro-Eurasian and Australasian group. But something I wanted to highlight with the whistlers and the orioles is that something really interesting about these two groups is that they both have members that are poisonous. Yes, poisonous birds. So they actually sequester toxins from the poisonous insects that they eat in their skin and their feathers. And it is thought that maybe this offers some protection from predators. Those poisons they pack a punch. Like these are the same class of poisons that are found in the poison dart frogs of the tropical Americas. And if you know anything about poison dart frogs, they include some of the most toxic animals on Earth. Yeah, and so a lot of these orioles and whistlers, they don't have the poison in as high concentrations as in the dart frogs, but it's still plenty enough to make them taste pretty bad. And in fact, the local people who live alongside those species, they do not hunt those birds unless they have to because they are just so nasty tasting because of those poisons. So certainly they seem to have protective function against predators, and probably they also have protective function against parasites as well. And yeah, it is quite interesting because these whistlers and these orioles that have these poisons, they seem to have evolved this ability multiple times independently of each other. And in fact, there is another representative of the Corvidae that is known to be poisonous, and that is a member of the corvoids called the ifrit. It's called the blue-capped ifrit, and it is another example of a poisonous member of this group. And all these, or most of these poisonous members, are found on the island of New Guinea for some reason. So is there something about that island that causes members of Corvidae to evolve poison? I think we don't know, but that does seem like a really intriguing and interesting pattern, if so. Um, so yeah, that is pretty cool. Now, this group, the butcherbirds and wood swallows, they're called the artamids together, and they include a very infamous and highly feared bird from Australia. So that bird, as Australians will know, is the Australian magpie, which is pictured here.
Oh.
And so it is not closely related to the true magpies, although it's somewhat close because the magpies are corvids, which are members of corvoids. But you can see here that the artamids are not members of corvoids, even though they're both members of the Corvides. Yeah, sorry again. I didn't come up with these names. Sorry. But anyways, the Australian magpie, yeah, is not a magpie at all, but it is a member of the butcherbirds and the wood swallow group. And the reason it is so highly feared is that it is one of those species that can be extremely aggressive when it is protecting its young. And so yeah, people in Australia talk about swooping season, and that's when the magpies, the Australian magpies, are breeding, and yeah, you had to watch out, or they might swoop at you. Yeah. Now, most of the time they don't really cause serious injury to people, but if you're not careful, they could make you lose an eye or something. So yeah, they can be problematic in some places. But yes, that is something that they're quite infamous for. Now, apparently, anecdotally, I know people who have said that Australian magpies are actually capable of recognizing individual humans, and so apparently they will specifically swoop at people who have been mean to them, basically. And but whereas if you're nice to them or provide them with food, they can actually recognize you and choose to adjust their attitudes accordingly. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. And while I was in Australia, while I was visiting Australia, I did actually get to see Australian magpies. Fortunately, I did not get swooped. I did get swooped by a honey eater, which is interesting. But fortunately, that was a much smaller bird, so it wasn't it wasn't too alarming. But it was a little bit startling, I guess, because I just felt this kind of thing go like kind of right behind my head, and then I turned around and was like, oh, and yeah, it's a much smaller bird than the Australian magpie, but yeah, I made sure to get out of the area so I didn't agitate it further. But that was interesting experience. So technically, I have gotten the Australian kind of swooping experience, but not from the Australian magpie. Yeah, I will also add that the butcherbirds and wood swallows, including the Australian magpie, have remarkable songs. Like they have really complex, like these whistling kind of tunes. They have amazing vocal talents, and yeah, it doesn't really sound anything like corvids at all. That's one way in which they're not like corvids. They look a bit superficially alike, but yeah, in terms of their vocalizations, once you hear them, you can definitely tell that is not a corvid call. And finally, one thing I'll add about them is the wood swallows are a group that have converged on the true swallows. So the swallows are another group of songbirds that we have not gotten to yet. But yeah, they are these aerial hunters that they will swoop around through the air and catch insects while in flight. And they are amazing flyers. And I got to see a couple of them in Australia as well. And yeah, they are amazing creatures. So yeah, the artamids are a really cool group of Corvideans. The bush shrikes are a group that is actually restricted to Africa, interestingly enough. And they are, as you can see in the image here, a lot of them are quite colorful, but they can be pretty hard to see because they can be quite secretive. They like to stay in these densely vegetated areas. And so, yeah. Also, a good prize if you see one on a birding trip as well. And then we have the Vengas, and the Vengas are a group of birds that are they're also found in continental Africa and Asia, but they are most diverse on the island of Madagascar. And really, I think the Vengas should be the textbook example of adaptive radiation. So the phenomenon where like a single lineage suddenly becomes super diverse in a very short period of time and expands into many, many different types of niches, which often happens on islands. That's because the Vengas are a super diverse group and a really triumphant example of this adaptive radiation phenomenon. So you have a species like this, the helmeted vanga, which is pictured here, which looks a little bit like a small toucan, I guess, with his big bill, and uses that to catch like small vertebrates like chameleons and things like that. It's all large insects. But there are many other types of vangas that look very different. Like you have species that feed on the ground, you have species that climb up and down tree trunks. You have species that have a really long decurved bill for probing into crevices. Yeah, you have species that have a large hooked bill on the end, like probably for like butchering small animals. So they are remarkably diverse, and unfortunately, you don't hear about them so much, but I really think that they are kind of the underappreciated example of adaptive radiation within songbirds because yeah, they are amazing and go look at some pictures of them if you haven't if you're not
Hmm.
familiar with them. Um, but yeah, lastly, we have a group called the Corvoids, and they are so diverse that I'm going to have to go to the next slide to cover them. So they also span a pretty wide range of different groups. So you have the fantails, which are found mostly in Australasia, but they go into continental Asia as well. You can tell how they got their name. They have these really long tail feathers that spread out into this nice wide fan, and they're one of the groups of birds that specialize for fly catching behavior. So they kind of swoop out from a perch at flying insects, and that long fan-like tail actually helps them do this because what it seems that they'll do is that they'll actually when they're hunting for insects, they'll kind of fan the tail out at intervals, and those bold patterns kind of just flash out when they do this. And it seems that this kind of behavior seems to scare insects, and so an insect that might be hiding can get flushed out when they see this flash, this sudden bright flash of color of white, and then the fantail can swoop out and grab them. The drongos are another group that are they also engage in kind of fly catching behavior, but they can go after bigger prey than the fantails can. They have a more robust bill than the fantails do and tend to be bigger. And the drongos are pretty widely distributed. Like you can find them all over Asia and Africa, for example. And they are, in some ways, they're kind of the Afro-Eurasian counterparts to the tyrant flycatchers because drongos are also known for being very aggressive towards predators. They do very similar kind of mobbing behavior. They'll swoop at raptors, sometimes even making direct contact with them. Um, and yeah, they're a pretty cool group of birds. I've seen them in Taiwan before. They're one species, the black drongo, is a commonly seen a bird. You'll just see them perched out in the open on like telephone wires and things, and they sometimes swoop out and sally out and catch insects. So yeah, they are cool to see. And they are also very good vocal mimics. This is actually a segment on the documentary we mentioned earlier, the BBC documentary series Africa, where they show drongos kind of hanging out near meerkats, and the meerkats kind of appreciate this because the drongos will give out warning calls when a predator is present, and so gives them extra protection. However, it turns out that drongos will sometimes take advantage of this and they'll give out false warning calls when there is no danger present. And then, as the meerkats run for cover, the drongos will steal whatever food they have dug up and then make off with it. And not only that, but the drongos will not only like give their own alarm call and use it this way, but they can also mimic the alarm calls of meerkats. Because sometimes the meerkats wise up, and then they're like, okay, sometimes the drongo just gives a warning when there isn't any. Um, but of course, they're gonna heed the alarm call of their own species, and so sometimes the drongo will actually mimic the alarm call of meerkats and then pull the same trick with that. So yeah, that was a pretty fun sequence on Africa. I remember first reading about that study when that first reported that behavior when it came out, and then later on it made it into a natural history documentary. It's always kind of fun to see things like that happen, like a newly discovered behavior like getting into the kind of popular media. Um,
Definitely.
yeah, and then we have birds of paradise. We kind of mentioned them before. They're primarily found on the island of New Guinea, although there are a few species on like Australia as well. And yeah, like you probably don't need me to tell you like how amazing birds of paradise are. Like so many different forms and varieties of courtship displays. It's incredible. Yeah, like yeah, go look up some pictures of birds of paradise. They're amazing, and we kind of mentioned earlier about how their kind of tropical forest environment probably helped drive this kind of super elaborate courtship behavior. Um, it is really cool. I remember I think it was on Planet Earth 2 where they showed Wilson's bird of paradise doing its courtship display. And it's just amazing where the male actually goes to the trouble of creating a clearing. Like he'll remove all the leaf litter in a little area, and then he has this vertical perch that he perches on where he displays. And then what's really interesting is people are starting to appreciate um, how do these displays actually look from a female's perspective? Because and that's what they filmed in the Planet Earth 2, is that the female Wilson's bird of paradise watches the male from above, and so there's actually aspects of the display that you can't really see if you're just observing it from the side. And it turns out that the male, when during his display, he actually like kind of flashes this little panel of feathers on his chest and flicks it upward, and it catches the light in such a way that it just glows and shines with this bright iridescent green. And yeah, that it is incredible. And I think that was the first time that particular perspective was filmed. And so that was a really cool sequence.
Oh yeah, that was really a treat.
Yeah.
The Wilsons is probably my favorite of the birds of paradise.
It's amazing. Yeah, yeah. It's definitely one of my favorites. I think the only competition it would have is probably King of Saxony Bird of Paradise,
Oh
which
yeah.
is one that has these like really long like eyebrow feathers, quote unquote eyebrow feathers, and each of these feathers have like these little flags on them, like these tassels. Like it's so wild. Yeah. Anyways, go look up footage and pictures of Birds of Paradise because they're amazing. Um, but moving on, there's the monarchs. The monarchs are another fly catching group, so sometimes they're called the monarch flycatchers. And yeah, they're found pretty much all over Afro-Eurasia, mostly in the tropical regions, and a lot of them have made their way out onto many of the remote Pacific islands as well. So they're very strong flyers. They can make their way across these long stretches of ocean. Um, and then we come to a group, the shrikes, which are actually found in many of the more temperate regions of the world. So we do get shrikes in Europe and in North America, northern North America, that is. Um, and shrikes are definitely very infamous for a particular type of behavior. Shrikes are basically the songbird version of a raptor, and they hunt large insects but also small vertebrates. But when we say small vertebrates, sometimes they're going after prey that is bigger than themselves. Like they can go after like mice that outweigh them. Um, and yeah, they are very fierce and effective hunters. And there was a pretty recent study that documented how shrikes are able to kill prey larger than themselves. And what they'll do is like they'll grab a mouse by the back of the neck, and they have a slightly hooked bill, so that helps them hold on to their prey. And then they'll shake the mouse so hard that its neck breaks, and that's how they
Mm.
kill their prey. Yeah, pretty brutal. Um, but I think even more infamously is what they do after they've killed their prey. And what they do is that they will actually impale their prey on sharp objects. So things like thorns of plants or like sharp sticks. They'll use like barbed wire fences for that purpose, for that matter. And there are a couple reasons why they do this. So one is to store food. So they'll actually build up these larders. Like they're very macabre. So just these bushes that filled with like small animals impaled on top of them. Yeah, I mean it works for food storage. And in fact, they actually use this as part of their strategy for dealing with some of their defenses of the prey. For example, they'll go after like poisonous insects, but they won't eat the insects immediately. They'll just leave the insects out on the thorn for a little bit until it dries, and the poison is no longer toxic after a few days of being in the sun. Um, and and yeah, that's a pretty interesting type of behavior. Now, another reason that they will do this kind of impalement behavior is the fact that, as we mentioned before, songbirds tend not to have like these very powerful talons that you would see in like a raptor, because they've simplified so many of the foot muscles. Remember that. And so Shrike isn't going to be as effective at holding down its prey with its feet like a raptor would be able to. And so what it does is that it will impale the prey on a sharp object, and then with the prey anchored to the thorn or the other sharp object that it's using, they can then tear the prey into pieces from that position, and so that's helpful. So yeah, a really interesting group of birds. I've been lucky enough to see wild shrikes a few times, and yeah, they are very cool. They are very cool birds. Definitely not maybe not the most pleasant birds from a moral perspective, but these aren't humans we're talking about. These are wild
Yeah.
animals. So yeah, I think their behavior is definitely very fascinating for what it is. And probably the best known group of corvoids, and probably Corvideans in general, are the corvids, and they include the crows and the jays and the magpies and such. We've kind of already talked a little bit about them back in the previous episode when we were talking about bird intelligence, because along with the parrots, the corvids are some of the most intelligent birds there are, and in many ways, their cognitive abilities have been shown to be on par with many of the primates. And so, yeah, very, very intelligent birds, and probably in part because of this, they can be found pretty much all over the world. And they're one of the groups of songbirds that probably did not originate in Australia, but have dispersed back into Australia. So they are now Australian corvids, even though that kind of returned to like the motherland of all songbirds, even though they themselves did not originate there. And yeah, the Australian corvids are some of the few species of Australian wildlife that can feed on the invasive cane toads, and that's because they have learned to like turn the cane toads over. So cane toads are like deadly poisonous to most of the Australian carnivores, because yeah, they didn't co-evolve with the cane toads, and so cane toads are highly toxic, and most Australian carnivores, if they eat a cane toad, they'll just keel over and die. Um, but yeah, the corvids have learned to kind of deal with this. They'll actually flip over the cane toads and attack their bellies where there are no poison glands, and then kind of eat them from the underside up. So yeah, that's a pretty neat, and probably to their credit in terms of their problem-solving abilities. There have been experimental studies that have shown that like rooks, which are kind of corvid, rooks are able to reenact the Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher. You know the story, right? The crow sees like a pitcher of water, but it can't reach the water with its bill, so it throws stones in there until the water level rises enough for it to drink from the pitcher. Of course, when I was a kid and heard this story, I was like, oh, okay, that's a story. That probably doesn't actually happen. But people have done experimental research where they provided rooks with pebbles and tubes of water that they could not reach with their bills, and the rooks actually figured it out. They actually dropped stones into the tubes of water until the water level raised high enough for them to drink from it. And yeah, yeah, they can do it, and there are loads and loads of other studies on corvid intelligence, and we actually talked a little bit about them last time. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to go into detail here, but it is quite remarkable that we have this really super intelligent group of dinosaurs, and the fact that it happened a second time, the first time with the parrots, that have similar cognitive abilities, and certainly for this reason, corvids are of great interest to many researchers and also members of the general public as well, because of these reputations. And yeah, of course, you always have a good time watching corvids. I think they're always nice to see around. Do you have anything to add?
No, I definitely agree. Corvids are just a pleasant sight. I mean, just all the studies that I've been able to read and see on like nature documentaries
Yeah,
about their intelligence and like the facial recognition stuff, the tool use,
right.
just remarkable. Just and I think it's funny that they have this reputation in popular culture. And especially going back into like medieval times, where like there's
Yes.
sinister things that are up to no good.
Right.
When it's like nowadays I see more and more people like recognize the intelligence of these birds,
Yeah.
and then they love these birds. It's like a complete flip.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think they're more appreciated today than they have ever been.
I think so too. Yeah, and yeah, I definitely agree there. I will acknowledge that. Yeah, because of their intelligent ways, I think there can be times when corvids make nuisances out of themselves from our perspective. But I definitely do see the kind of pop cultural shift too, that more and more people are starting to appreciate them for their ingenuity, and the fact that they are such familiar wildlife can be readily observed all around us, in most parts of the world. Yeah, I think it's great that they're getting much better press nowadays. Alrighty, let's continue to the next slide. Hey everybody. So this is Albert editing in post. As it turns out, this episode ended up being so long that we have decided to split it into two different parts. So if you want to continue listening to or watching the episode, please see the link to the second half in the description below.